Naaman and the River of Humility, a Christian Bible story of healing through obedience. Intro. When pride stands between us and healing. You stand at the edge of a river. The water is brown, murky, nothing special. Behind you are the greatest physicians of your nation, the finest robes money can buy, and a lifetime of victories that have earned you honour in the eyes of kings. But none of it can heal what lives beneath your skin. Sometimes, the greatest barrier to healing is not the illness itself, but the pride that tells us we deserve something grander, something more worthy of our status. This is a story about a powerful man who travelled far seeking a miracle, only to discover that God's power often works through the simplest acts of obedience. It unfolds in the ancient Near East, in a time when nations clashed and prophets spoke with authority that made kings tremble. The kingdoms of Israel and Aram existed in a constant state of tension, sometimes at war, sometimes at uneasy peace, always watching each other across borders that shifted with the outcomes of battles. In this world, reputation meant everything. A man's name could open doors or close them forever. And at the centre of our story stands a question we all must answer, in our own time and in our own way. Will we humble ourselves enough to receive what we cannot earn? Will we trust God's methods even when they contradict our expectations? Will we choose obedience over pride when the two stand in opposition? This is not just an ancient story. It is a mirror held up to every heart that has ever struggled with the tension between what we think we deserve and what God offers freely. It is about healing that goes deeper than skin, transformation that touches the soul, and the unexpected places where grace appears when we are finally humble enough to receive it. Chapter 1. A commander with authority. His name was Naaman, and in the kingdom of Aram that name carried weight. It opened doors, it commanded respect. It struck fear into the hearts of enemies and inspired confidence in the hearts of allies. He was commander of the army, a position earned not through birthright or political manoeuvring, but through brilliance on the battlefield and loyalty to his king. When Naaman spoke, soldiers listened. When he strategized, enemies fell. When he led his troops into battle, victory followed more often than not. The king of Aram himself honoured this man, recognizing that through Naaman's leadership, the Lord had given victory to the nation. This is a remarkable acknowledgement, appearing in the biblical text itself. Even a pagan king recognized that Naaman's success came from a power beyond mere military skill. There was something about this commander that set him apart, something that made him more than just another soldier who had risen through the ranks. He was valiant, brave in a way that inspired others to be brave. He was strategic, able to see the battlefield not just as it was, but as it would be 3 moves ahead. He was respected, earning the kind of loyalty from his men that cannot be commanded but must be given freely. But victory has a way of hiding what happens behind closed doors. Beneath the armour and the accolades, Naaman carried a secret that no sword could defend against and no strategy could defeat. He had leprosy. The disease was slowly claiming his skin, marking him with something that all his power and prestige could not erase. In the ancient world, leprosy was more than a medical condition. It was a social death sentence, a mark of impurity that could separate a person from everything they knew and everyone they loved. For a man like Naaman, the disease must have been particularly cruel. His entire identity was built on strength, on capability, on the ability to control outcomes through skill and determination. But here was something beyond his control, something that reduced him from commander to patient, from powerful to powerless. In public, he was the mighty commander, reviewing troops and planning campaigns and receiving the honours due to a national hero. In private, he was a man watching his own body betray him, knowing that even the greatest warrior cannot fight what lives within, cannot win a battle against an enemy that is part of himself. The leprosy would have started small, perhaps, a patch of discoloured skin, a spot that did not heal, a sensation of numbness where there should have been feeling. But Naaman would have known what it meant. He would have recognised the signs, would have understood that this was the beginning of something that would only progress, only worsen, only spread until it consumed everything he had built, and there was nothing he could do about it. No battle strategy could defeat it. No amount of honour or wealth or military genius could cure it. For the first time in his life, Naaman faced an enemy he could not overcome through his own strength. Chapter 2. The Captive Servant Girl. In Naaman's household served a young girl from Israel, taken captive during one of Aram's raids into enemy territory. We do not know her name. The biblical text does not record it, and perhaps that is fitting. She represents all the unnamed people throughout history, whose faith has changed the world in ways they could never have imagined, whose simple words have altered the course of events, whose obedience to God has brought healing to places of pain. She had lost everything. Her home, whatever dwelling she had known in Israel, was now beyond her reach. Her family, if they had survived the raid, was separated from her by distance and circumstance. Her freedom, the most precious possession of any human being, had been stripped away. She belonged now to Naaman's household, serving his wife, performing the daily tasks expected of a servant in a wealthy home. She ground grain and drew water and prepared food, and attended to her mistress with no choice in the matter, no control over her own life, no power to change her circumstances. Yet somewhere in her captivity, she had not lost her faith. This is the remarkable thing. She had every reason to be bitter, to curse the God of Israel for allowing her to be taken, to turn away from faith in a deity who seemed to have abandoned her to slavery in a foreign land. But she had not. Her faith remained intact, a quiet flame that continued to burn even in the darkness of her captivity. She knew about the prophets in Israel. She remembered the stories of God's power. She held on to the belief that the God she served was capable of miracles, even here, even now, even in the house of her captors. She served Naaman's wife, and in that service she watched. She saw the burden her master carried. She saw the worry in his wife's eyes, the concern that no amount of wealth or status could ease. She saw the private pain behind the public power, and one day she spoke. Her voice was small but certain, the words of someone who possessed no authority except the authority of truth. She told her mistress about a prophet in Samaria, a man of God named Elisha who could heal the commander. Think about that moment. Consider what it required of this young girl. She had every reason to remain silent, to let her captor suffer, to find satisfaction in the downfall of the man whose army had torn her from her home. Some might have seen Naaman's leprosy as divine justice, as punishment for the raids he had led, as fitting retribution for the suffering he had caused. But this girl did not think that way. When she saw suffering, even the suffering of her captor, she offered hope. When she had the opportunity to withhold information that could help, she chose instead to speak truth. When silence would have been easier and perhaps emotionally satisfying, she chose compassion. This is radical faith. This is the kind of faith that does not wait for perfect circumstances or ideal situations before it acts. This is the faith that sees a need and responds, that holds no grudges, that believes God's healing power is meant for everyone, even enemies, even those who have caused harm. The servant girl could not have known what would happen next. She could not have foreseen that her words would lead to international diplomacy, to a confrontation between prophet and commander, to a healing that would echo through the centuries. She simply spoke truth when truth was needed, and trusted God to do the rest. Sometimes the voice of God comes from the most unexpected places. It comes from those we overlook, from those who have nothing to gain except the knowledge that they spoke truth when silence would have been easier. It comes from captives and children and outcasts and servants, from all the people the world dismisses as insignificant. This young girl had no power, no status, no voice in the larger world. But she had faith, and she had compassion, and she had the courage to speak, and that was enough to set in motion a miracle. Chapter 3. The Journey for Healing. Naaman took the servant girl's words to his king, and the king of Aram did what kings do when their greatest commander is in need. He did not dismiss the suggestion as the superstitious rambling of a captive child. He did not ignore the possibility that healing might be found in enemy territory. Instead, he treated it as a serious diplomatic matter, worthy of official correspondence and royal support. This tells us something about how much Naaman was valued, how important he was to the security and success of the nation. A king does not go to such lengths for just any soldier. The king of Aram wrote a letter to the king of Israel, carefully worded in the formal language of international diplomacy. The letter would have been carried by official messengers, sealed with the royal seal, presented with all the ceremony appropriate to communication between monarchs. And he sent Naaman on what was essentially a diplomatic mission of healing, a journey that blurred the lines between politics and prayer, between military necessity and personal need. Naaman travelled with an entourage befitting his status. This was not a secret trip or a humble pilgrimage. This was a commander travelling in full view of the world, with the backing of his king and the resources of a nation at his disposal. He brought 750 pounds of silver, a staggering amount of wealth that would have required multiple pack animals to transport. He brought 150 pounds of gold, precious metal that represented not just money, but power, prestige, the ability to open any door and purchase any service. He brought 10 sets of clothing, fine garments that were themselves markers of status and wealth in the ancient world. He carried the letter from his king like a golden ticket, expecting doors to open, expecting honour, expecting a healing worthy of a commander. In his mind, the journey probably seemed straightforward. He would arrive in Israel with his impressive entourage. He would present the letter from his king to the king of Israel. The king would arrange for the healing, perhaps through court physicians or religious rituals. Naaman would be cured, would return home in triumph, would resume his life with this obstacle removed. It all made perfect sense according to the logic of power and privilege that governed his world. But when the king of Israel read the letter requesting that he cure Naaman of leprosy, everything went wrong. The king's response was not gratitude or careful diplomacy, but sheer panic. He tore his robes in distress, a dramatic gesture that signalled either mourning or extreme agitation. "Am I God," he cried to anyone who would listen, "that I can kill and bring back to life? This king sends a man to me to cure him of leprosy. See how he is seeking a quarrel with me." The king of Israel saw it as a trap, a political setup designed to create conflict. In his mind, the king of Aram was setting impossible conditions, asking for something no human could provide so that when it was not provided, war could be justified. It was a paranoid interpretation, perhaps, but not entirely unreasonable given the history between these two nations. The king of Israel understood his own limitations. He knew he could not heal leprosy. He had no prophets on retainer, no miracle workers at his beck and call. He was just a man, a political leader trying to navigate the dangerous waters of international relations, and now he was being asked to do the impossible. The king did not see what was really happening, that God was orchestrating something far greater than politics, that healing was coming, just not through royal power or political manoeuvring. The miracle would not come from a palace, but from a prophet. It would not be arranged through diplomacy, but through divine intervention. The king of Israel was right that he could not heal Naaman, but he was wrong to think that meant no healing was possible. He simply was not looking in the right place. Chapter 4. The prophet's unexpected response. When Elisha the prophet heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes in distress, he sent word. The message was simple and direct. "Why have you torn your robes? Send Naaman to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." There is confidence in that statement, a certainty that comes not from arrogance, but from faith. Elisha knew what the king did not, that God's power was not limited by human inability, that miracles were not the province of politics but of prayer, that healing was available to anyone, even a foreign commander, if they were willing to receive it on God's terms. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Picture the scene. A military commander accustomed to leading armies, now standing at the threshold of a prophet's dwelling. The contrast would have been stark. Naaman's entourage would have been impressive, designed to command respect and attention. The horses and chariots alone would have announced his importance, the thunder of hooves and wheels declaring that someone significant had arrived. His retinue would have included servants and guards, advisors and attendants, all the trappings of power and prestige. But Elisha's house was just a house, nothing grand or impressive, no palace or temple, just the dwelling of a prophet who lived simply and trusted God completely. Naaman waited at the door. A commander does not wait often. He commands, and others move. He speaks, and people listen. He arrives, and doors open. But here he stood, at the threshold of a simple prophet's dwelling, waiting like any other petitioner, his status and wealth temporarily irrelevant. And then came the insult, though Elisha likely did not intend it as such. The prophet did not come out to meet him. He did not greet this powerful foreign commander with the respect Naaman was accustomed to receiving. There was no ceremony of welcome, no acknowledgement of his status, no show of honour appropriate to a man of Naaman's rank. Instead, Elisha sent a messenger, the intermediary, someone to deliver instructions second-hand, as if Naaman were just another person seeking help rather than a commander of armies. The messenger's words were even more shocking in their simplicity. "Go and wash in the Jordan River 7 times, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be clean." That was it. No grand ceremony, no elaborate ritual, no dramatic laying on of hands or invocation of divine power, no recognition of the journey Naaman had made, the wealth he had brought, the risk he had taken in coming to enemy territory. Just water, just obedience, just the Jordan River, a muddy stream that could not compare to the great rivers of Damascus. 7 times, no more and no less. The instruction seemed almost dismissive in its simplicity. Go wash, as if leprosy were dirt that could be rinsed away, as if healing were as simple as bathing, as if the terrible disease that had driven Naaman hundreds of miles from home could be cured by something anyone could do, something that required no special skill or knowledge or power. The very ordinariness of the instruction was offensive to a man who had travelled far and brought much, who expected something extraordinary, something worthy of his suffering and his status. Chapter 5. The offence of simplicity. Naaman went away angry. The biblical text does not soften this. It does not say he was disappointed or confused or thoughtfully considering his options. It says he was angry, furious, rage-filled at what he had just experienced. You can picture the scene. A decorated commander, face flushed with indignation, turning his chariot around, his entire entourage witnessing his humiliation. The horses would have stamped and snorted as the reins were jerked hard, the chariots wheeling about in the dirt outside Elisha's house, the whole impressive procession preparing to leave as abruptly as it had arrived. He had expected Elisha to come out to him, to emerge from the house with appropriate reverence for who was calling. He had expected the prophet to call on the name of the Lord his God in some impressive display of spiritual authority. He had expected Elisha to wave his hand over the spot where the leprosy marked his skin, to perform some mystical gesture that would demonstrate power and produce healing. He had expected theatre, drama, something befitting the journey he had made and the wealth he had brought, something worthy of a commander. Instead, he got instructions to bathe in a river. The disappointment must have been crushing. After all this, after the servant girl's promise and the king's letter and the long journey and the fortune and gifts, after putting his hope in this foreign prophet and risking his dignity by seeking help in enemy territory, he was being told to do something so simple that it felt like mockery. Worse, he was being told to do it in the Jordan River, a waterway that Naaman clearly considered inferior to what he knew from home. Are not the Abana and Pharpar rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? He fumed to anyone within earshot. He was not wrong, at least not from a purely aesthetic perspective. The rivers of Damascus were famous for their clarity and beauty, fed by mountain springs, running clean and cold through the Syrian landscape. The Jordan River, by contrast, was muddy and warm, winding through the hot valley between Israel and the territories east of it. Nothing special to look at, nothing that would seem to possess healing properties. Could I not wash in them and be cleansed? Naaman demanded. It was a rhetorical question born of frustration, but it revealed the heart of his struggle. If healing were just about water, any water should do. If it were just about washing, he could wash at home. The fact that Elisha had specified the Jordan River made the whole thing feel arbitrary, like a test designed to humiliate rather than heal, like Elisha was exercising power just to prove he could, making Naaman jump through hoops for the prophet's own amusement. His servants watched as their master's pride nearly cost him everything. They had travelled with him, had witnessed the hopes he had carried, had seen him vulnerable in ways that commanders rarely allow themselves to be seen. And now they watched as he stood at the very edge of a miracle, so close to healing that he could almost touch it. Yet his expectations, his sense of what he deserved, his need for something grander and more impressive, almost sent him home unchanged, uncured, defeated not by leprosy but by his own pride. Pride has a way of doing that. It convinces us that God's methods are beneath us, that simple obedience is insulting, that we deserve something grander, something more complex, something that requires us to demonstrate our worth through difficulty, rather than receiving grace through simplicity. Pride tells us that easy things cannot be valuable, that if healing does not cost us effort and pain and struggle, then it cannot be real. Pride makes us walk away from miracles because they do not arrive in the package we expected, because they do not honour us in the way we think we should be honoured, because they require us to humble ourselves in ways that feel degrading to our sense of self. Naaman's anger was pride wounded by simplicity. He wanted to earn his healing through something difficult, something that would showcase his strength and determination. He wanted the healing to be impressive enough that it matched his status, complicated enough that not everyone could receive it, exclusive enough that it confirmed his specialness. Instead, he was being offered something free, something simple, something that required nothing from him except the willingness to obey an instruction that made no sense to his rational mind. The servants watched and waited, knowing that what happened next would determine everything. Would their master let pride send him home to die slowly of leprosy? Or would he find the courage to do something small, something that required not physical strength, but spiritual humility, not military prowess, but simple faith? Chapter 6. The Servant's Wisdom. Naaman's servants approached him carefully. They knew their master's temper, had seen it flare on battlefields when plans went awry, or soldiers failed to execute orders precisely. They knew the danger of speaking to a man whose pride had been wounded, whose anger was radiating off him like heat from a forge. In the social hierarchy of the ancient world, servants did not contradict their masters, did not offer unsolicited advice, did not presume to correct the thinking of those above them. But these servants did something remarkable. They chose to speak anyway, with the kind of gentle wisdom that can only come from those who have nothing to lose and everything to hope for. "My father," one of them said, using a term of respect that acknowledged Naaman's authority, while also claiming a kind of familial relationship, a bond that gave them the right to speak truth. "If the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it?" The question was perfectly crafted, cutting through Naaman's anger to reach the logic beneath it. Of course he would have done something great. That was the whole point. Naaman had travelled hundreds of miles precisely because he was willing to do whatever it took to be healed. He had brought a fortune in gifts because no price was too high. He had risked his dignity by seeking help from a foreign prophet because he was desperate enough to try anything. "How much more then," the servant continued, "when he tells you to wash and be cleansed?" The logic was undeniable. and the servants knew it. They were not asking Naaman to reconsider something difficult. They were pointing out the absurdity of refusing something easy. If he was willing to do great things, why would he refuse to do small things? If he was willing to undergo elaborate rituals or painful procedures or demanding tests of endurance, why would he reject a simple instruction to wash in a river? The very ease of it should have been a gift, not an insult. Their words carried a wisdom that transcended their social status. They understood something that Naaman, in his anger and pride, had missed, that the difficulty of a task has nothing to do with its effectiveness, that God's power is not measured by the complexity of the method, that healing does not require elaborate procedures to be legitimate. They understood that Naaman's real struggle was not with the Jordan River, but with his own expectations, not with Elisha's instructions, but with his own need to feel that he had earned what he was about to receive. Think about what these servants were doing. They were risking their master's wrath to save his life. They could have remained silent, could have let Naaman's pride carry him home to certain death, could have avoided the potential punishment that comes from speaking uncomfortable truth to power. But they chose to speak because they cared more about Naaman's healing than about their own safety. They chose wisdom over silence, truth over deference, love over fear. This is what true servants do in every age and in every context. They speak truth when truth is needed, even when it is risky. They offer wisdom when wisdom is lacking, even when it might be rejected. They care more about the well-being of those they serve than about protecting themselves from potential consequences. These servants embodied a kind of loyalty that went deeper than mere obedience to orders. They were loyal to Naaman's ultimate good, even when that meant contradicting his immediate wishes. Sometimes the people closest to us see more clearly than we do. They see past our anger to our need, past our pride to our pain, past our stated reasons to our actual fears. They understand that what we say we want is not always what we actually need. They recognize that our objections are often symptoms of deeper struggles, that our anger is often a mask for fear or disappointment or shame. And when they love us enough, they risk telling us what we need to hear rather than what we want to hear. Naaman stood at a crossroads, the kind that comes to all of us at various points in our lives. Would he listen to the servants who spoke wisdom? Would he let their logic penetrate his pride? Would he choose to see their intervention not as further humiliation, but as an act of grace, an opportunity to step back from the edge of a terrible mistake? The servants had done their part. They had spoken. They had offered a way forward. Now it was up to Naaman to decide whether he would humble himself enough to take it. And sometimes listening to those who serve us, hearing the wisdom of those we might be tempted to dismiss because of their social status or their lack of formal authority, saves our lives. Not just physically, though sometimes that too, but spiritually and emotionally and in all the ways that matter. The servants could not heal Naaman's leprosy. They could not perform miracles or change water into something medicinal. But they could do something equally important. They could speak truth that cut through pride and pointed toward obedience. And in that moment, that was exactly what Naaman needed. Chapter 7. The Act of Humility. Naaman went down to the Jordan River. That simple sentence contains a universe of internal struggle and spiritual transformation. Can you imagine that walk from where his servant spoke to him to where the river ran? Each step was a choice to humble himself, to release his expectations, to trust that God's way might not match his own. Each step was a death to pride and a birth of faith, a movement away from what made sense according to the world's logic, toward what made sense only in the logic of grace. The water was unremarkable when he reached it, the river ordinary, the whole scene lacking any sense of ceremony or significance. There were no trumpets announcing a miracle, no gathering of prophets to witness the healing, no crowd to observe and validate what was about to happen. Just Naaman and his servants standing at the edge of a muddy river in enemy territory, about to do something that felt foolish by any normal standard. He went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times as the man of God had instructed. The first immersion must have been the hardest. The water was warm and brown, nothing refreshing or cleansing about it by ordinary standards. Naaman would have felt the mud between his toes. the current pulling gently at his body, the weight of his own doubt pressing down on him like a physical thing. He went under, came up, looked at his skin. Nothing had changed. The leprosy was still there, marking him, claiming him, unmoved by mere water. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing changed. The servants watched from the bank, perhaps wondering if they had been wrong to encourage this, if they had led their master toward false hope and deeper disappointment. 4 times. 5 times. Still the leprosy remained, stubbornly present, seemingly mocking the whole exercise. Each immersion without visible result must have tested Naaman's fragile faith a little more, must have made the instruction to complete all 7 seem increasingly absurd. 6 times, and his skin looked the same as it had when he arrived in Israel. At this point, Naaman had done more than most people would. He had humbled himself, had followed the instruction, had immersed himself over and over in water that seemed to do nothing. If healing was going to happen, surely it would have happened by now. Surely 5 or 6 times would be enough, if any number would be enough. The temptation to stop, to decide that this was not working, to let anger and disappointment and frustration take over again, must have been intense. But Naaman went under a 7th time. He completed the instruction exactly as it had been given, not stopping at 6 because that seemed like enough, not adding an 8th because 7 had not immediately produced results, but simply obeying the word of the prophet with precision. He went under the surface of the Jordan one more time, felt the water close over his head, perhaps prayed, or perhaps simply hoped, or perhaps just mechanically followed through because he had come this far and might as well finish. And when he came up from that 7th immersion, something had happened. His flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. The leprosy was gone, completely, not improved or reduced or stabilized, but gone. His skin was not just healed, but renewed, transformed, made fresh and whole in a way that went beyond mere absence of disease. The text says it became like that of a young boy, suggesting not just healing, but rejuvenation, not just cure, but restoration to a state of health and vitality that he might not have known for years. The miracle he had travelled so far to find came not through grand ritual, but through simple obedience. 7 times in ordinary water, 7 acts of humility, 7 moments of choosing trust over pride, faith over logic, obedience over expectation. The number 7 carried significance in Hebrew thought, representing completion and perfection, and here it represented the completion of Naaman's journey from pride to humility, from sickness to health, from skepticism to faith. Think about what this meant. The healing came not in the first immersion, not in the moment of initial obedience, but in the completion of the instruction. If Naaman had stopped at 6, he would have gone home still sick, would have concluded that the prophet was a fraud and that faith in the God of Israel was misplaced. But he persisted. He trusted. He completed what he had been told to do, even when it seemed pointless, even when nothing appeared to be happening, even when every rational part of his mind must have been screaming that this was a waste of time. And in that persistence, in that commitment to complete obedience rather than partial obedience, in that willingness to look foolish if necessary, but to follow through on what God had commanded through the prophet, Naaman found healing. Not because the water of the Jordan had special properties, but because God had chosen to work through that water, in that place, at that moment, in response to obedience that required Naaman to lay down everything that had defined him, his pride, his expectations, his need for control, his insistence that healing come in a way that honoured his status. The servants on the bank must have erupted in amazement and joy when Naaman emerged from the 7th immersion with new skin. They had been right to speak. Their wisdom had saved their master's life. But more than that, they had witnessed a miracle, had seen with their own eyes that the God of Israel was real and powerful and willing to heal even a foreign commander who had barely begun to understand faith. They had stood at the edge of the ordinary and watched it transform into the extraordinary, had seen a muddy river become the site of divine intervention, had witnessed proof that God's ways are not human ways, and that miracles come through obedience rather than through impressive ceremonies. Naaman himself must have stood in the water for a long moment, looking at his hands, his arms, touching his face, examining every inch of skin that had been marked by disease and was now clean. The relief would have been overwhelming, the gratitude profound, the sense of having received something he could never have earned or purchased or achieved through his own strength absolutely clear. He had come seeking healing and found it, but not in the way he expected, not through the means he anticipated, not in a manner that confirmed his assumptions about how God works. He found healing through humility, through the willingness to do something small and seemingly insignificant, through obedience that required him to trust what he could not understand. And in that moment, standing in the Jordan River with clean skin and a transformed heart, Naaman became more than just a healed man. He became a living testimony to the power of simple faith, to the grace of a God who meets us in our need and heals us in ways that strip away our pride and build our trust, to the truth that sometimes the greatest miracles come wrapped in the most ordinary packages. Chapter 8. Healing beyond the physical. Naaman returned to Elisha, but he was a different man than the one who had left in anger just hours or perhaps days before. The journey back to the prophet's house was not the same as the journey away from it. Where there had been rage, there was now wonder. Where there had been disappointment, there was now gratitude. Where there had been wounded pride, there was now humble faith. He and all his attendants went back to the man of God and stood before him, and this time there was no impatience, no expectation of grand ceremony, no anger at being made to wait. When Elisha came out to meet him this time, or perhaps when Naaman was invited inside, the commander spoke words that revealed just how deep his transformation had gone. "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel," he declared. This was not a casual acknowledgement or polite gratitude. This was a confession of faith, a theological statement that marked a complete shift in Naaman's understanding of the divine. He had grown up in Aram, surrounded by temples to various gods, living in a polytheistic culture where different deities were thought to have different domains and different powers. He would have known the names of these gods, would have participated in rituals honouring them, would have assumed that each nation had its own deities who fought alongside their armies and blessed their endeavours. But now, having experienced the power of the God of Israel firsthand, having been healed through means that made no sense except in the context of divine intervention, Naaman was making an exclusive claim. Not just that Israel's God was powerful, but that Israel's God was the only true God, that all other deities were false or impotent by comparison. His healing had become more than physical. Something had shifted in his understanding of the divine, in his relationship with ultimate reality, in his grasp of how the universe actually works. He had come seeking the cure of his body and found something deeper, a transformation of his soul. The leprosy that had marked his skin was gone, but something even more significant had happened. The spiritual blindness that had kept him from recognizing the true God had been healed as well. He could see now, not just with physical eyes, but with spiritual perception, that he had encountered something real and true and powerful in a way that transcended all his previous religious experiences. He had encountered a God who did not need his wealth, who did not require his status, who did not operate according to the rules of power and prestige that govern Naaman's world. This was a God who healed through humility, who worked miracles through obedience, who restored not just flesh but faith. This was a God who could not be manipulated or controlled or purchased, who gave freely rather than in exchange for payment, who required nothing but trust and obedience and a willingness to lay down pride. Naaman's confession was all the more remarkable because of who he was and where he came from. He was not a nobody. He was not someone whose opinion carried no weight. He was a commander, a man of influence and authority, someone whose words would be reported back to his king and would be repeated among the soldiers who served under him. His confession of faith in the God of Israel was a political statement as much as a personal one. a declaration that would have consequences beyond his own life, that would raise questions and eyebrows and perhaps even tensions in the polytheistic culture he was about to return to. But Naaman did not seem concerned about any of that. He had experienced something real, and he was not going to hide it or downplay it or translate it into terms that would be more acceptable to his culture. He stood before Elisha and spoke the truth as he now understood it. There is no God in all the world except in Israel. It was a bold claim, an exclusive claim, the kind of claim that transforms everything about how a person lives and thinks and relates to the world around them. This is what real healing does. It does not just fix the immediate problem, it transforms the person who receives it. Physical healing is wonderful, necessary, life-changing in its own right. But when physical healing opens the door to spiritual transformation, when the miracle of restored flesh leads to the miracle of restored faith, when the God who heals the body also captures the heart, that is something even more profound. That is the kind of healing that lasts not just for the remainder of a lifetime, but for eternity. Naaman had come to Israel as a pagan seeking a cure from a prophet rumoured to have power. He was leaving as a believer, someone who had encountered the living God and would never be the same. His skin was clean, yes, but his soul was cleansed as well. His body was restored, but his spirit was awakened. He had been made whole in every sense of the word, healed not just physically but spiritually, restored not just to health, but to right relationship with the divine. And this dual healing, this transformation that touched both body and soul, was the real miracle. The clean skin was evidence of God's power, but the changed heart was evidence of God's grace. Anyone with enough power could heal skin, at least theoretically, but only God could transform a proud commander into a humble believer. Only God could take a pagan soldier and make him into a confessor of faith. Only God could use something as simple as water and obedience to remake a person from the inside out. Chapter 9. The refusal of payment. Naaman urged Elisha to accept a gift from him, to take some portion of the vast wealth he had brought on the journey. "Please accept a present from your servant," he said, using language that indicated his changed perspective. He was no longer demanding recognition as a powerful commander. He was presenting himself as a servant, humble before the prophet and the God the prophet represented. In Naaman's world, in the culture and context he knew, this made perfect sense. It was the only way he knew how to respond to such a profound gift. Everything in Naaman's experience suggested that healing should be paid for. When physicians treated illness, they were compensated. When priests performed rituals, they received offerings. When anyone provided a service, especially a service as valuable as restoring health and saving a life, payment was expected and appropriate. Money was how value was acknowledged, how gratitude was expressed in concrete terms, how debts were recognized and honored. For a man like Naaman, who had access to significant wealth and understood the world primarily through transactions and exchanges, offering payment was not just polite but necessary. Moreover, Naaman had brought all this wealth specifically for this purpose. The 750 pounds of silver, the 150 pounds of gold, the 10 sets of fine clothing, all of it had been packed and transported with the expectation that it would be needed, that healing would come at a cost, that the prophet would rightfully expect compensation for such a valuable service. To return home with all of it still in his possession would seem strange, wasteful, almost insulting to the prophet who had facilitated his healing. But Elisha refused. "As surely as the Lord lives whom I serve, I will not accept a thing," the prophet said. The oath was strong, invoking God as witness to his refusal, making it clear that this was not a matter of negotiation or polite refusal that could be overcome with insistence. This was a firm no, grounded not in pride or in some attempt to appear above material concerns, but in a deep theological principle. And even though Naaman urged him, pressed him, tried to convince him to take at least something, Elisha would not relent. He would not take it. This refusal was itself a teaching moment. a lesson as important as the healing itself. Elisha was making a point, demonstrating something crucial about the nature of what had just happened. Healing was not a transaction. It could not be purchased, could not be earned, could not be reduced to an exchange of goods and services. What Naaman had received was not the result of the prophet's skill or power, but of God's grace. Elisha was merely an instrument, a messenger, someone through whom God had chosen to work. To accept payment would be to suggest that the healing had been Elisha's doing, that it was something he had provided through his own abilities, something for which he deserved compensation. But that was not true, and Elisha would not allow Naaman to misunderstand what had happened. The God of Israel could not be bought. His miracles were not for sale. His grace could not be purchased with silver or gold or fine clothing or anything else humans might offer. What Naaman had received was a gift, pure and simple, freely given, requiring nothing but faith and obedience, and the only appropriate response was gratitude and changed living, not payment. This was radically different from the religious systems Naaman knew. In the pagan temples of his homeland, everything had a price. Want the gods to bless your crops? Bring an offering. Want to ensure victory in battle? Make a sacrifice. Want healing or protection or prosperity? Pay the priests, bring the gifts, perform the rituals, and maybe, if the gods were pleased, you would receive what you sought. Religion was transactional, a system of exchanges where humans gave things to the gods in hopes of receiving blessings in return. But the God of Israel did not operate that way. He gave freely. He healed because he chose to heal, not because payment had been offered. He worked miracles out of grace, not in response to bribes or payments or attempts to purchase his favour. Elisha's refusal to accept anything from Naaman was a demonstration of this principle in action. It was a way of saying, this healing was not about what you brought or what you can offer. It was about God's power and your willingness to trust and obey. That is all that was required. That is all that will ever be required. The refusal must have been uncomfortable for Naaman. It left him with a debt he could not repay, a gift he could not reciprocate, a feeling of owing something that he had no way to settle. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps that discomfort was itself instructive, teaching Naaman something about grace that he could not have learned if Elisha had accepted payment. Grace leaves us in debt. It gives us something we cannot earn and cannot repay. It places us in a position of permanent gratitude, of ongoing recognition that we have received what we did not deserve and could never have purchased. And that is exactly where God wants us to be. Not trying to earn what has been freely given. Not attempting to pay for what was offered as a gift. Not reducing our relationship with the divine to a transaction where we give and receive in equal measure. Instead, living in the awareness that we have been given something precious without deserving it, that we have received grace we cannot repay, that the only appropriate response is a life lived in gratitude and obedience and continued trust in the God who heals freely. Elisha's refusal was an act of prophetic teaching, a moment of instruction that went beyond words to demonstrate in action what grace actually means. The prophet would not compromise this principle, not even to be polite, not even to make Naaman comfortable, not even to accept wealth that could have been used for good purposes. The point was too important. The lesson was too crucial. What Naaman had received was a gift, and gifts are not purchased. They are received with gratitude, and then they transform how we live. Chapter 10. A Changed Life. Before Naaman left, he made an unusual request, one that reveals just how deep his transformation had gone, and how seriously he was taking his new faith. "If you will not accept a gift," he said to Elisha, "then please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry." The request might seem strange to modern ears, but it made perfect sense in Naaman's cultural context. "For your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord," he continued, explaining his reasoning. He wanted soil from Israel, actual dirt to take back to Aram so he could worship the God who had healed him on the very ground where that God was known and honoured. In the ancient world, gods were often thought to be connected to specific territories, to have power in particular lands and among particular people. Naaman's request for Israelite soil suggests he wanted to create, in his homeland, a small piece of Israel, a space where the God of Israel could be properly worshipped even in foreign territory. It was a beautiful, almost childlike faith. There was something pure and earnest about it, a desire to do everything right, to honour God in the way he understood would be most appropriate. Naaman was trying to figure out how to live as a believer in the God of Israel while returning to a land filled with other gods, other temples, other expectations. He was attempting to work out the practical implications of his newfound faith, to create a way to worship that would honour what he had experienced while acknowledging the realities of where he lived and what his position required of him. Naaman also acknowledged the complexity of his situation with remarkable honesty. "But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing," he said. "When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm and I have to bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." He was describing his official duties, the ceremonial obligations that came with being commander of the army and advisor to the king. When the king of Aram went to worship in the temple of Rimmon, a Syrian god, Naaman would be required to accompany him, to physically support the king as he bowed, and in doing so, Naaman himself would have to bow as well. This was not hypocrisy or a lack of commitment. This was the honest struggle of someone trying to figure out how to live faithfully in a context that did not support that faith, how to honour God while fulfilling obligations to an earthly king, how to navigate the tension between internal belief and external requirements. Naaman was not asking for permission to continue worshipping other gods. He was asking for understanding regarding actions he would be required to perform as part of his official duties, actions that might look like worship but that he was committing in his heart to not treat as such. Elisha's response was brief and gracious. "Go in peace." The prophet did not condemn Naaman for the complexity of his situation. He did not demand that Naaman immediately resign his position or refuse his duties, or create a dramatic confrontation with his king. He simply blessed him and sent him on his way, trusting that a man whose faith was sincere enough to ask these questions was a man whose faith would continue to grow and deepen over time. So Naaman left, transformed in every way that mattered, physically restored, his skin clean and healthy like that of a young boy, free from the disease that had been slowly destroying him, spiritually awakened, having encountered the living God and committed himself to worshipping only that God, no matter how complicated that commitment might be in practice. Emotionally renewed, having experienced grace that healed not just his body, but his sense of worth and his understanding of how the universe works and his relationship with the divine. He left carrying as much Israelite soil as 2 mules could bear, a literal and symbolic piece of Israel that he would take home and use to create a space for worship. He left with a new understanding of God that would shape the rest of his life. He left with a story he would tell, a testimony of healing that would spread, that would be remembered, that would echo through the centuries as an example of what happens when pride gives way to humility, when expectation gives way to obedience, when a powerful person becomes humble enough to receive what they cannot earn. The man who had arrived in Israel proud and sick departed humble and healed. The commander who had expected impressive ceremony discovered that miracles come through simple obedience. The pagan who had known many gods found the one true God. And all of it happened because a servant girl spoke truth, because servants offered wisdom, because a prophet refused to be impressed by wealth and status, because Naaman finally humbled himself enough to wade into a muddy river 7 times, and because God chose to pour out grace on someone who could not earn it and did not deserve it, but was willing to receive it on God's terms rather than his own. Epilogue: the power of simple obedience. The story of Naaman and the river reminds us that God's instructions may seem small, even insignificant, when measured against our expectations and our sense of what is appropriate or effective or impressive. 7 times in a muddy river. That was all it took. That was the sum total of what was required for a miracle that changed everything. But those 7 immersions required something harder than any great deed, something more challenging than any elaborate ritual, something that many people, then and now, find almost impossible. The willingness to lay down pride, to trust what we do not fully understand, to obey when obedience seems beneath us or pointless or unlikely to produce results. Humility unlocks healing that pride keeps locked away. This is true not just for physical healing, though Naaman's story demonstrates that truth powerfully, but for every kind of healing we might need. Emotional healing often requires the humility to admit we're not okay, to seek help, to be vulnerable with others about our struggles. Relational healing requires the humility to acknowledge our part in conflicts, to apologize even when we think we're only partially at fault, to extend forgiveness even when it feels undeserved. Spiritual healing requires the humility to recognize that we cannot save ourselves, that we need grace we cannot earn, that God's ways are higher than our ways and His thoughts higher than our thoughts. Pride tells us we deserve better, that we should wait for something more impressive, that simple obedience is beneath people of intelligence or status or capability. Pride makes us like Naaman at the door of Elisha's house, angry that the healing does not come with appropriate ceremony, offended that what is offered does not honour our sense of importance, ready to walk away from miracles because they arrive in packages we do not respect. Pride costs us healing, costs us transformation, costs us the very things we most desperately need, all because we cannot bring ourselves to do something simple. But faith can grow even in foreign lands, even in captivity, even in circumstances that seem hostile to belief. The young servant girl demonstrated this. Taken from her home, living as a slave in the household of her captor, she nevertheless maintained faith in the God of Israel and in the power of that God to heal. Her faith did not depend on comfortable circumstances or on being surrounded by other believers or on having religious freedom. Her faith was a quiet flame that continued to burn regardless of external conditions, and when the moment came to speak, she spoke hope rather than bitterness, healing rather than revenge, faith rather than despair. This is the kind of faith that changes the world, the kind that persists in darkness, the kind that speaks truth even when there is no apparent benefit in doing so, the kind that believes God can work miracles even in the most unlikely circumstances. It is faith that does not wait for perfect conditions before it acts, that does not require everything to be ideal before it hopes, that trusts God's power regardless of the surrounding darkness. And it is faith that we are all called to cultivate wherever we find ourselves, whatever our circumstances, however hostile or foreign or difficult our situation might be. Naaman's healing was not just about restored skin. It was about a restored relationship with the divine, about learning that God's ways are not our ways, that miracles come through obedience more than through ceremony, that sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply doing what we are told, even when it makes no sense to us, even when it seems too simple to be effective, even when our pride screams that we deserve something grander. The healing of Naaman's body was the visible sign of a deeper healing that was taking place in his soul, a transformation that moved him from pride to humility, from expectation to trust, from resistance to obedience. And that transformation is available to all of us, in whatever rivers we are called to enter, in whatever simple acts of obedience we are asked to perform. The specifics will differ. For Naaman, it was 7 immersions in the Jordan. For us, it might be something else entirely, some instruction from God that seems too simple, or too strange, or too humbling to be the path to healing. But the principle remains the same. God often works through the ordinary to accomplish the extraordinary, through the simple to achieve the profound, through the humble to manifest the miraculous. Sometimes the path to restoration begins with the willingness to obey what we do not fully understand. We want explanations, we want guarantees, we want to know why and how and what will happen if we comply. But faith does not always come with those assurances. Sometimes faith means taking the first step into the river without knowing what will happen, immersing ourselves once, then twice, then 3 times, persisting even when nothing seems to be changing, trusting that if God said 7 times, then 7 times is what will accomplish the healing we need. The river waits. Not the literal Jordan, perhaps, but whatever river God is calling each of us to enter, whatever simple act of obedience we are resisting because it does not match our expectations or honour our sense of importance, or seem adequate to address the magnitude of our need. The river waits, and the healing is there, ready to be received, available to anyone willing to humble themselves enough to obey. All that remains is the question: will we humble ourselves enough to receive it? Will we be like Naaman at the door of Elisha's house, angry and resistant and ready to walk away? Or will we be like Naaman in the Jordan River, humble and obedient and willing to complete what we have been instructed to do, even when it makes no sense, even when it seems pointless, even when pride tells us we deserve something better? The choice is ours. The healing is available. God's grace is offered freely, requiring nothing but trust and obedience, asking only that we be willing to lay down our expectations and pick up simple faith, that we be willing to enter whatever river we are called to enter and immerse ourselves as many times as we are told, trusting that God knows what he is doing even when we do not. And if we can find that humility, if we can muster that obedience, if we can persist through the first 6 immersions when nothing seems to be happening and trust God enough to complete the 7th, we may discover what Naaman discovered, that God is faithful, that his methods work even when they do not make sense, that healing comes to those who are humble enough to receive it on his terms rather than demanding it on their own. May we all have the wisdom of the servant girl who spoke hope when she could have remained silent. May we all have the courage of the servants who spoke truth to power when silence would have been safer. May we all have the humility of Naaman in the river, willing to look foolish if necessary but determined to obey fully, trusting that God's simple instructions are the path to the miracles we most desperately need.
Hello, dear friend, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know, how has your day been? Whether you're listening to this in the quiet hours of evening, perhaps as the sun sets wherever you are in the world, or if it's late at night and you're ready to rest, I hope you'll find peace in the story we're about to share together. Are you listening from a cosy bedroom in America, perhaps from a small town in England, or maybe from somewhere across the vast expanses of Australia or Canada? Wherever you are, whatever time zone cradles you tonight, you're welcome here. If this is your first time with Sacred Slumber, I invite you to subscribe so these stories can accompany you through many peaceful nights ahead. Now, let's settle in together and journey back to an ancient time, to a small town called Zarephath, where a miracle unfolded that would echo through the ages. The sun blazed mercilessly over the land of Israel, its rays beating down upon cracked earth and withered fields. For 3 long years, not a single drop of rain had fallen from the brass-coloured sky. The rivers had dwindled to dusty beds, lined with sun-bleached stones, and the wells that once bubbled with fresh water now echoed hollow when a stone was dropped into their depths. This terrible drought was no accident of nature. It was the judgment of the Almighty God upon a nation that had turned away from him. King Ahab, weak and easily swayed, had married the pagan princess Jezebel, and together they had led Israel into the worship of false gods, Baal, the supposed god of rain and fertility, and Asherah, the goddess of the sea. Golden calves and wooden idols dotted the landscape, where altars to the true God once stood. Into this spiritual darkness had stepped a man unlike any other, Elijah the Tishbite, a prophet wrapped in rough camel's hair, his eyes blazing with the fire of divine purpose. He had confronted King Ahab with words that still rang in the air. As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except at my word. For months after delivering this pronouncement, Elijah had hidden by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan River. There in that secret place, ravens, those dark messengers of the wilderness, brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, while he drank from the brook's clear waters. It was a time of solitude and communion with God, but even this sanctuary could not last forever. Day by day, Elijah watched the brook grow shallower. The musical babbling that had once lulled him to sleep grew quieter until it was barely a whisper. Soon only scattered puddles remained, then mere dampness in the sand, and finally nothing but a dry bed where life-giving water had once flowed. It was then, when human resources failed and earthly security vanished, that the word of the Lord came to Elijah again. Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. Zarephath. The name meant a place of refining, and how fitting it would prove to be. This small Phoenician town, nestled along the Mediterranean coast north of Israel, was under Gentile rule, beyond the borders of the chosen people, in a land where Baal and Asherah were worshipped openly. Yet it was here, in this unlikely place, that God would work one of his most tender miracles. So Elijah gathered his simple possessions, his mantle, his staff, and the unwavering faith that had sustained him through these years of drought and hiding. The sun was high as he began his journey northward, his feet raising small clouds of dust from the parched earth. Behind him lay the dried brook and the memories of miraculous provision. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the promise of God's continued care. As he walked, Elijah might have pondered the strangeness of God's ways. Here was a Hebrew prophet, a man who had proclaimed judgment upon Israel for their worship of foreign gods, now being sent to a foreign land where those very gods were revered. Yet if the years had taught him anything, it was that the Lord's thoughts were higher than his thoughts. and the Lord's ways past finding out. The journey from the Jordan Valley to the coastal region of Zarephath would take several days. Elijah travelled through landscapes scarred by drought, abandoned villages where the wells had run dry, fields where the stubble of failed crops crunched beneath his sandals, and hillsides where olive trees stretched their gnarled branches skyward in silent supplication for rain that would not come. At night he slept under stars that seemed to burn with unusual intensity in the clear, dry air. The moon, when it appeared, cast sharp shadows on the lifeless landscape, and sometimes he could hear, in the distance, the mournful cry of jackals searching for water in the empty wadis. But even as the physical landscape spoke of judgment and desolation, Elijah's heart remained anchored in hope. The same God who had sent ravens to feed him, who had made water spring from rock for Moses, who had provided manna in the wilderness for the children of Israel, had promised that a widow in Zarephath would care for him. It seemed impossible, even absurd. What widow in this time of famine would have enough to share? Yet Elijah had learned that impossibility was often the very stage upon which God chose to display his glory. On the third day of his journey, the scent of the sea began to reach his nostrils, carried on breezes that offered little relief from the heat, but spoke of his approaching destination. The landscape gradually changed from the brown hills of inland Palestine to the terraced slopes that descended toward the Mediterranean coast. In the distance, he could see the blue expanse of the Great Sea, its surface shimmering like hammered metal under the relentless sun. As he crested the final hill before Zarephath, Elijah paused to survey the town spread below him. It was modest in size, its flat-roofed houses clustered around a small marketplace, with narrow streets winding between them like tributaries of a dry river. The town's walls, though not as grand as those of the great cities, spoke of a community that had weathered many storms. Fishing boats lay pulled up on the beach, their nets spread out to dry, though in these days of little rain, even the sea seemed less generous with its bounty. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys, a sign that even here, far from Israel, the effects of the drought were being felt. Fuel was precious, when every piece of wood might be needed for cooking what little food remained, and families were learning to make do with cold meals and carefully rationed provisions. As Elijah descended the hill toward the town gate, his stomach reminded him that it had been hours since his last meal. The ravens no longer came with their mysterious daily provision, and the bread in his travelling pouch was long since consumed. For the first time in months, the prophet experienced the gnawing uncertainty that had become the constant companion of countless families throughout the region. But even as hunger and weariness pressed upon him, Elijah's step remained steady. Somewhere in this foreign town was a widow whom God had prepared to be his instrument of provision. The prophet did not know her name, her face, or her circumstances. He knew only that the Lord had spoken, and that was enough. The sun was now approaching its zenith as Elijah neared the gates of Zarephath, his shadow a small dark pool at his feet. Soon, very soon, he would meet the woman through whom God intended to demonstrate that his care extends beyond all human boundaries, his provision beyond all human understanding, and his power beyond even the finality of death itself. The stage was set for a miracle that would begin with a simple request for water and a piece of bread, but would culminate in wonders that neither the prophet nor the widow could have imagined. In this place of refining, in this encounter between a Hebrew man of God and a Gentile woman of faith, the character of the Almighty would be revealed in ways both tender and magnificent. The gates of Zarephath stood open in the midday heat, their wooden beams weathered and worn by countless seasons of sun and storm. As Elijah approached, he could see that the usual bustle of a town entrance was notably absent. No merchants haggled over goods, no children played in the dust, No elders sat in the shade discussing the affairs of the day. The drought and its accompanying famine had drained the life from this place, leaving behind only the essential movements of survival. Elijah's throat was parched from his long journey, and his lips were cracked from the dry air. Each step sent small puffs of dust up from the hard-packed earth, and the prophet found himself scanning the area, hopefully for any sign of a well or fountain. His eyes, accustomed to the blazing light of the Palestinian sun, squinted as he tried to make out the details of his surroundings. It was then that he noticed her, just outside the town gates near a grove of scraggly olive trees that had somehow managed to survive the prolonged drought. A woman was bent over, methodically gathering fallen sticks and dead branches. Her movements were slow and deliberate, speaking not of laziness but of the careful conservation of energy that comes from prolonged hunger. Her clothing, once perhaps a deep blue or brown, had faded to the nondescript colour of dust and wear, patched in several places with fabric that didn't quite match. As Elijah drew closer, he could see that she was neither young nor old, but somewhere in that middle season of life, where a woman's beauty becomes less about the freshness of youth and more about the character etched in her features by joy and sorrow, hope and disappointment. Her dark hair, streaked with premature grey that spoke of hardship born before its time, was partially covered by a worn headscarf that had slipped back as she worked. There was something in her posture, a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical exhaustion, that made Elijah's heart stir with compassion. This was a woman who had carried burdens, who had made hard choices, who had watched her resources dwindle day by day until she was reduced to gathering sticks in the heat of the day. The prophet paused for a moment, studying her face as she worked. In her features, he could read the story of the drought's impact on ordinary people. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes shadowed with the particular kind of worry that comes from watching a child grow thin. Yet there was also a quiet dignity about her, a refusal to surrender to despair, even in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. "Excuse me," Elijah called softly, his voice rough from thirst and travel. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the appearance of this stranger. His rough clothing, his weathered features, the staff in his hand that marked him as a traveller from far away. In her gaze, Elijah could see the wariness that had become second nature to people in these hard times. Strangers might bring news, trade or help, but they might also bring additional mouths to feed when food was already desperately scarce. "Please," Elijah continued, his manner gentle and respectful, "could you bring me a little water in a cup, that I may drink?" The request hung in the air between them. Water, in this time of drought, was precious beyond measure. Every drop had to be carried from wells that were increasingly distant and depleted. Yet something in the prophet's manner, perhaps the genuine need in his voice, or the courtesy with which he had made his request, caused the woman to hesitate rather than refuse outright. She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his character in his features. What she saw there must have reassured her, for she slowly straightened, her bundle of sticks still clutched in her arms. "I will bring you water," she said simply, her voice carrying the accent of this coastal region, but also a warmth that suggested a heart not yet hardened by suffering. As she turned toward the town, Elijah felt a stirring of gratitude. Here, in this foreign place, this Gentile woman was willing to share her precious water with a Hebrew stranger. It was a small act of kindness, but in a world grown harsh with want, small kindnesses took on the weight of great acts of mercy. But the Lord had sent him here for more than water, and Elijah knew that his true test and hers was yet to come. "Wait," he called gently, as she began to walk away, "and please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." The woman stopped as if struck. She turned back to him, and now her face bore an expression of such profound sadness that Elijah felt his heart constrict. The weariness he had noticed before was nothing compared to the look of desperate finality that now clouded her features. "As the Lord your God lives," she replied, and there was no anger in her voice, only a crushing weariness and the terrible honesty of someone who has nothing left to lose. "I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. See, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." The words fell between them like stones dropping into a deep well. This was not the casual refusal of someone unwilling to share, nor the calculated response of someone hoarding resources. This was the stark reality of a mother who had come to the end of all earthly hope, who had measured her remaining provisions with the careful precision of someone planning a final meal. Elijah felt the weight of her despair, but he also felt the stirring of something else, the peculiar lifting of spirit that came when he sensed the Lord was about to move in power. How often had he seen this pattern? The moment when human resources failed completely was precisely the moment when divine intervention began. "Do not fear," he said, and his voice carried a new authority, a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his own understanding. The words were not merely a comfort, but a command, spoken with the certainty of someone who had learned to recognize the voice of the Almighty. The woman's eyes widened at the change in his tone. Something had shifted in this stranger's demeanour, as if he had suddenly remembered who he was and whom he served. "Go and do as you have said," Elijah continued, "but make me a small cake from it first and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son." The request seemed almost cruel in its audacity. Here was a woman who had just confessed that she and her child were preparing to eat their last meal before death, and this stranger was asking her to give him the first portion. By any human standard of fairness or compassion, the request was outrageous, but Elijah was not speaking from human wisdom now. He was speaking as one who had learned to see beyond the visible, to understand that sometimes the pathway to blessing required actions that seemed to defy common sense. "For thus says the Lord God of Israel," he proclaimed, and now his voice carried the full weight of prophetic authority. "The bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." The promise hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. On one side stood the widow's desperate reality, empty bins, empty jars, and the approaching spectre of death. On the other side stood the word of a God she barely knew, spoken through a stranger whose only credentials were the conviction in his voice and the authority with which he spoke. The woman stared at him, her mind undoubtedly racing. Everything in her experience told her that flour and oil, once consumed, were gone forever. Everything she had learned about the world spoke against the possibility of vessels that never emptied, of resources that renewed themselves. She had no reason to trust this foreigner, no evidence that his God was any more real or powerful than the gods her neighbours worshipped. Yet something in his eyes, something in the absolute certainty with which he had spoken, gave her pause. She had lived long enough to recognise truth when she heard it, even when that truth seemed to contradict everything she thought she knew about the world. The choice before her was stark and simple, yet it carried implications that reached far beyond the immediate moment. She could refuse, clinging to what little she had, and eat her final meal with her son in the privacy of her own home. Or she could trust, stepping out in faith toward a promise that seemed too wonderful to believe, risking the immediate needs of her child on the word of a stranger's God. As she stood there in the dusty street of Zarephath, with her bundle of sticks still clutched in her arms, and the prophet's words echoing in her mind, the widow found herself at one of those crossroads that define a life. Her next decision would determine not only whether she and her son lived or died, but whether they would become part of a story that would be told for generations to come. A story of faith rewarded, of divine provision, and of the God who sees beyond the boundaries that divide nations and peoples. The sun beat down upon them both as she weighed her choice, but in that moment of decision, neither the heat nor the hunger nor the desperate circumstances seemed to matter. All that mattered was whether she would choose to believe that the impossible might, just possibly, be true. The widow stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity, though in reality it was perhaps only the span of a few heartbeats. In that suspended moment, the entire universe seemed to be waiting for her decision. The very air around them felt charged with possibility, as if creation itself was holding its breath to see whether faith would triumph over fear, whether hope would overcome the stark mathematics of survival. Elijah watched her face carefully, seeing the battle that raged within her soul. He had delivered the word of the Lord as he had been commanded, but now the choice was hers alone to make. The prophet knew from long experience that God's miracles often hinged not on human understanding, but on human obedience, not on the ability to see how a promise might be fulfilled, but on the willingness to act as if it already had been. The woman's eyes moved from Elijah's face to the bundle of sticks in her arms, then toward the town gates where her small home awaited, where her son was undoubtedly waiting for her return, probably listening for the sound of her footsteps that would signal the beginning of their final meal together. She thought of his thin face, his two bright eyes that spoke of a child who had learned too young what it meant to be hungry, and her heart clenched with the fierce protectiveness of motherhood. Yet something else stirred within her as well, a memory perhaps of stories she had heard as a child about the God of the Hebrews, the one who was said to part seas and rain bread from heaven. Or perhaps it was simpler than that, nothing more than the recognition that she'd already lost everything that could be lost, and in that place of complete surrender there was a strange kind of freedom. "I will do as you have said," she whispered finally, her voice so quiet that Elijah had to lean forward to hear her words. The decision, once made, seemed to infuse her with new energy. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her grip on the bundle of sticks, and began walking toward the town gates with a purpose that had been absent from her movements before. Elijah followed at a respectful distance, marvelling at the courage it must have taken for her to choose trust over terror, faith over the apparent facts of her situation. The narrow streets of Zarephath were largely empty in the heat of midday, but the few people they encountered looked at the odd pair with curiosity. The widow, known to her neighbours as a woman facing starvation, was walking with determined steps beside a foreign stranger whose very presence seemed to radiate an unusual intensity. Word would spread quickly through the small community that something unusual was happening at the house of the widow woman. Her home, when they reached it, was modest even by the standards of a fishing town. The flat-roofed dwelling was built of the local stone, its walls weathered by countless seasons of Mediterranean storms. A small courtyard in front contained an outdoor oven that had seen little use in recent weeks, its stones cold and covered with a fine layer of dust. A few clay pots stood in the shade, and a wooden door, worn smooth by years of use, led into the main room of the house. As they approached, the door opened and a boy appeared, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, with his mother's dark eyes and hair. His frame was thin in the way that spoke of prolonged hunger, but his face lit up with genuine joy at seeing his mother return. That joy dimmed slightly as he noticed a stranger accompanying her, replaced by the cautious curiosity of a child who had learned to be wary of unexpected changes in routine. "Mother?" he said, his voice carrying a question that encompassed much more than the single word could express, the widow reached out and touched her son's face gently, a gesture that spoke of infinite tenderness and perhaps also of farewell. "This is Elijah, a prophet of the Lord God of Israel," she said simply. "We're going to prepare food and he will eat with us." The boy's eyes widened. In their current circumstances, sharing food with anyone, even a guest, represented an act of generosity that bordered on the impossible. Yet he had learned to trust his mother's judgment, and if she said this man would eat with them, then somehow it would be so. Inside, the house was cool and dim, a welcome relief from the blazing heat outside. The main room served as both living area and kitchen, with sleeping quarters in a small adjoining chamber. Clay storage jars lined one wall, most of them standing empty like silent witnesses to the family's dwindling resources. Only 2 containers held anything of value. A small bin that contained the handful of flour the widow had mentioned, and an equally small jar that held the last precious drops of oil. The widow set down her bundle of sticks and began the familiar ritual of preparing a fire. She arranged the wood carefully in the outdoor oven, knowing that every stick must count, every flame must serve its purpose. As she worked, Elijah and the boy watched in respectful silence, each lost in his own thoughts about what was about to unfold. When the fire was burning steadily, the widow went to retrieve her flour and oil. She opened the bin and looked inside, seeing the meagre handful of grain that represented all that stood between her family and starvation. For a moment her resolve wavered. The practical voice of experience whispered that she was being foolish, that she was about to sacrifice her child's last meal on the word of a stranger. But then she remembered the authority in Elijah's voice when he had spoken his promise, the absolute certainty that had rung in his words like a bell struck in a clear mountain air. She had heard many people speak in her lifetime, merchants making promises they wouldn't keep, neighbours offering help they couldn't deliver, officials making proclamations that meant nothing. This had been different. This had carried the weight of truth spoken by someone who knew the one who held the universe in his hands. With steady hands, she measured out the flour, not all of it, but enough to make a small loaf, as Elijah had requested. She added the precious oil, drop by careful drop, then water from their dwindling supply. As she kneaded the dough, she found herself praying to the God of Israel, a God she knew only by reputation, but whom she was now trusting with everything she held dear. The bread baked quickly in the hot oven, filling the small courtyard with an aroma that made all their mouths water and their stomachs clench with longing. When it was finished, golden brown and still steaming, the widow placed it on a wooden plate and carried it to where Elijah sat waiting. "Here," she said simply, offering him the bread that might well be the last her household would ever eat. Elijah received the loaf with the gravity it deserved, understanding that he held in his hands not just food, but an act of faith that would echo through eternity. He broke it carefully, offering portions to both the widow and her son before taking any for himself. The bread was simple fare, coarse flour baked with skill born of necessity, but it tasted like the finest feast to 3 people who had known real hunger. As they ate, a comfortable silence settled over the small courtyard. The bread satisfied their immediate hunger, but more than that, it seemed to nourish something deeper. Hope, perhaps, or the peculiar peace that comes from taking a step of faith and finding solid ground beneath one's feet. When the meal was finished, the inevitable moment arrived. The widow rose to check her storage containers, knowing that according to every law of nature and economy, they should now be empty. The flour bin should contain nothing but dust and remnants, the oil jar nothing but the stained clay at its bottom. She opened the flour bin first, and her breath caught in her throat. Where she had expected to find emptiness, there was flour, not the handful that had remained before, but the same amounts that had been there that morning. Her hands trembled as she reached into the jar, running the grain through her fingers to assure herself that she was not dreaming. Next came the oil jar. She lifted it carefully, feeling its weight, hearing the liquid slosh against the sides. It was full as it had been when she had first measured out the precious oil for their bread. "Mother," her son whispered, seeing the wonder and disbelief that played across her features. "The word of the Lord is true," she breathed, her voice filled with awe. "The flour and oil have not diminished. They are just as they were before." From that day forward, the miracle continued. Each morning, the widow would wake expecting to find her containers empty, only to discover them filled with the same amounts they had held the day before. She would measure out flour for the day's bread, pour oil for cooking, and use what was needed to sustain her household and their guest. But each time she checked, morning, noon, and evening, the levels remained constant, as if invisible hands were replenishing what had been taken. Word of the miracle spread slowly through Zarephath. Neighbours who had expected to attend a funeral instead saw smoke rising daily from the widow's oven. They saw the boy playing in the courtyard with more energy than he had shown in months. They saw the foreign prophet living in their midst, his presence somehow bringing blessing rather than burden to the household that sheltered him. Some whispered that it was sorcery, others that the gods were showing favour to the widow for her kindness to strangers. But the widow herself knew better. She had witnessed firsthand the power of the God of Israel, the one who could multiply resources that seemed exhausted, who could bring abundance from scarcity, who could sustain life when death seemed certain. As weeks turned into months, the relationship between the widow, her son, and Elijah deepened into something like family. The prophet helped with daily tasks, told stories of his journeys and the wonders he had witnessed, and taught them both about the nature and character of the God he served. The boy, who had never known a father's presence, began to look up to Elijah with the mixture of respect and affection that a son shows to a beloved elder. For his part, Elijah found in this simple household something he had rarely experienced in his years of prophetic ministry, the warmth of ordinary human fellowship. Here, far from the palaces and temples where he usually delivered his messages, he discovered the profound joy of seeing God's love expressed through daily provision, through the laughter of a child who was no longer hungry, through the grateful smile of a woman who had learned to trust in the impossible. The jar and jug that never emptied became more than just a miracle of physical provision. They became symbols of a deeper truth, that the God of Israel was not limited by human boundaries, that his love extended beyond the chosen people to encompass all who would trust in him, that his power was sufficient to meet every need of those who placed their faith in his promises. In the small house in Zarephath, as the drought continued to devastate the surrounding lands, a different kind of abundance flourished. It was an abundance measured not just in flour and oil, but in faith rewarded, hope restored, and the quiet joy of lives sustained by the inexhaustible love of the Almighty. The seasons had begun to change, in the way they do even during the harshest droughts, with subtle shifts in the angle of sunlight and the patterns of wind that speak to those who know how to listen. Elijah had now been living in the widow's household for many months, and what had begun as a desperate act of faith had settled into a rhythm of daily miracle. Each morning brought the same wonder, jars that should have been empty filled with provision, hope renewed with the rising of the sun. The boy had grown stronger during this time, his cheeks regaining some of their childhood roundness, his eyes bright with the vitality that comes from adequate nourishment. He had become Elijah's shadow, an eager student, hanging on every word the prophet spoke about the wonders of God, helping with small tasks around the house, and bringing a lightness to their days that reminded all of them what joy looked like. His laughter had become one of the most precious sounds in that small courtyard, pure and musical, the kind of laughter that makes adults remember what it felt like to see the world as a place of infinite possibility. When he played with the wooden toys he had carved under Elijah's guidance, when he helped his mother tend their small herb garden, when he sat listening to stories of lions' dens and burning bushes, the boy radiated the particular happiness of a child who knows he is loved and secure. The widow, too, had blossomed during these months of miraculous provision. The constant worry that had carved lines around her eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet confidence that spoke of faith tested and proven true. She had learned to trust not just in the daily renewal of flour and oil, but in the character of the God who provided them. Her relationship with Elijah had evolved from desperate gratitude to genuine friendship, seasoned with the deep respect she held for his calling and his God. In the evenings, when the heat of the day had passed, the three of them would often sit together in the courtyard, watching the stars emerge in the clear sky. Elijah would tell them stories of his people's history, of Abraham's faith, of Moses' courage, of David's psalms, and gradually the widow and her son came to understand that they were not merely recipients of divine charity, but participants in a story much larger than themselves. It was during one of these peaceful evening conversations that the boy first began to cough. At first it seemed like nothing, perhaps a bit of dust in the throat, or the dry air that had been their constant companion throughout the drought. The widow offered him water, and he drank gratefully, the coughing subsiding as quickly as it had begun. They thought nothing more of it, and continued their conversation about the time when Elijah had called down fire from heaven to consume a sacrifice on Mount Carmel. But the next morning the boy woke with a flush in his cheeks that spoke of fever rather than health. His mother noticed immediately, the way mothers always do, and pressed her palm to his forehead with the practised concern of one who had nursed many childhood illnesses. He was warm, not dangerously so, but enough to cause worry. "It's nothing serious," she assured Elijah when she saw the concern in the prophet's eyes. "Children often take fevers during the changing of seasons. I have herbs that will help, and with rest he'll be well in a few days." Elijah nodded, but something in his spirit was troubled. He had learned over his years of walking with God to pay attention to such stirrings, even when they seemed to contradict the evidence of his natural senses. Still, he kept his concerns to himself, and joined the widow in tending to the boy with all the skill and care they could muster. For 2 days the illness seemed manageable. The boy remained in bed, accepting the herbal teas his mother prepared, sleeping more than usual, but still able to sit up and take some nourishment. His fever rose and fell in the typical pattern of childhood ailments, and there were moments when he seemed almost his normal self, asking Elijah to tell him again about the ravens that had brought bread and meat to the brook Cherith. But on the third morning, something changed. The boy's breathing became laboured, and his fever spiked higher than before. His eyes, when he managed to open them, seemed to look through rather than at the people who bent over him with growing concern. The flush in his cheeks deepened to an alarming red, and his small body trembled with chills that no amount of blankets could warm. The widow worked with desperate efficiency, trying every remedy she knew. She brewed stronger teas from the herbs that had always worked before, applied cool cloths to bring down the fever, and held her son close when the chills made him shake uncontrollably. But despite all her efforts, his condition continued to deteriorate. Elijah found himself in a terrible position. He was a prophet, accustomed to speaking with divine authority about the will of God, yet here he felt helpless in the face of a child suffering. He prayed earnestly, seeking guidance, seeking healing, seeking any word from the Lord about what was happening and why. But the heavens seemed silent. offering no immediate answer to his urgent petitions. By the fourth day, the boy could barely keep his eyes open. His breathing had become so shallow that both his mother and Elijah found themselves leaning close, just to assure themselves that he was still alive. The widow had not slept in 2 nights, maintaining a constant vigil beside her son's bed, and the strain was beginning to show in every line of her face. Perhaps, she said to Elijah, during one of the boy's brief periods of peaceful sleep, perhaps we should send for the physician from the next town. I know we have little to pay him with, but surely the physicians have no more power over this illness than we do, Elijah replied gently. This is not a sickness that earthly medicine can cure. The words hung between them, carrying implications that neither wanted to fully acknowledge. If earthly medicine could not help, if the herbs and treatments that had always worked before were proving useless, then they were facing something beyond the normal course of illness and recovery. They were facing the possibility that God might be calling this beloved child home. On the 5th morning, as the sun rose with its customary indifference to human suffering, the inevitable happened. The widow, who had dozed fitfully in her chair beside the bed, was awakened by a silence that was somehow more alarming than any sound could have been. She looked at her son and knew immediately that something fundamental had changed. His face, which had been flushed with fever, was now pale and still. His chest no longer rose and fell with the rhythm of breathing. The boy was gone. The widow's scream of anguish pierced the morning air, a sound so raw and primal that it seemed to tear through the very fabric of hope itself. She gathered her son's lifeless body into her arms, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down her face. "What have you done to me, O man of God?" she cried, turning to Elijah with eyes blazing with grief and accusation. "Have you come to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?" The words struck Elijah like physical blows. Here was a woman who had trusted him, who had shared her last meal based on his promise, who had opened her home to him for months. And now, in the presence of God's prophet, her only child lay dead. Without a word, Elijah gently took the boy from his mother's arms. "Give me your son," he said quietly, and despite her grief, something in his tone made her release her hold on the child. Elijah carried the boy to the upper room where he had been staying, laying him carefully on the bed. Then he fell upon his face before God, crying out with all the passion of his prophetic calling. "O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodge, by killing her son?" 3 times Elijah stretched himself upon the child, calling out each time, "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, like the first breath of dawn, after the longest night, the boy's chest rose. His eyes fluttered open, clear and bright, and he looked up at Elijah with wonder. "Teacher?" he whispered, his voice weak but unmistakably alive. Elijah gathered the boy in his arms, his own eyes wet with tears of joy and gratitude. "Come," he said, "let us go to your mother." When the widow saw her son walking down the stairs, alive and whole, she fell to her knees. "Now by this I know that you are a man of God," she declared through her tears, "and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth." The miracle at Zarephath teaches us profound truths that echo through the ages. First, we learn about faith in scarcity, how the widow trusted God's promise, even when her cupboards were bare and death seemed certain. Her willingness to give from her need rather than her abundance shows us that God often asks us to step forward in faith before we can see how he will provide. Second, we see the power of obedience before understanding. The widow didn't need to comprehend how flour and oil could multiply. She simply needed to trust the word of the Lord and act upon it. Blessings flowed not because she understood the miracle, but because she believed in the one who promised it. Third, this story reveals God's care beyond all boundaries. Here was a Hebrew prophet ministered to by a Gentile widow, showing that God's love transcends nationality, culture, and religion. The miracle in Zarephath foreshadowed the day when God's salvation would be offered to all nations. Finally, through Elijah's intercession for the dead boy, we glimpse God's ultimate power over life and death itself. This miracle points forward to the resurrection, hope that would one day be fully revealed in Christ, reminding us that with God, even death is not the final word. As our story draws to a close, I invite you to consider the empty jars in your own life, those places where resources seem exhausted, where hope feels depleted, where you wonder if God sees your need. The widow of Zarephath discovered that the God of impossible things delights in filling what appears empty, in multiplying what seems insufficient, in bringing life where death has reigned. Perhaps tonight, as you prepare for rest, you can release your own impossibilities into his capable hands. Trust that the same God who filled flour jars and oil vessels in ancient Zarephath is still working miracles today, sometimes dramatic and visible, sometimes quiet and hidden, but always rooted in his unchanging love for his children. The sun has set over that ancient town by the sea, and a gentle breeze stirs the olive trees, where a widow once gathered sticks in desperation, and found instead a destiny of faith. In that small house, the jars remained full, the boy grew strong, and 3 hearts learned to trust in the God of endless provision. May you rest tonight knowing that your own story is being written by the same loving hand, and that tomorrow's provision is already prepared by the one who never fails to keep his promises. Sleep well, dear friend, and remember, with God the jar never truly empties and hope is always renewable.
Before we begin tonight's journey through one of the most remarkable stories of courage and wisdom from ancient scripture, I want to take just a moment to connect with you, our community of listeners spread across the world. If you're enjoying this content and finding value in these stories, using your hype points on this video truly helps the channel more than you could possibly know. It is one of the most powerful ways you can support what we do here, and if you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps us reach more people who might benefit from these contemplative narratives. We also love hearing from you in the comments. If you feel like sharing, let us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing the global community that gathers here each night. And of course, if you enjoy this content and haven't already, subscribing means you'll never miss a story. Now, let's turn our attention to a tale from ancient Israel. A story that unfolds in the wilderness during one of the most turbulent periods in biblical history. This is not a story of armies clashing or kingdoms falling. Instead, it's something far more profound. A story about how one woman's wisdom prevented a massacre, changed the course of destiny, and revealed that sometimes the greatest victories come not through violence, but through discernment. Imagine a moment when history balances on a knife's edge. When anger threatens to consume reason, when vengeance seems not only justified, but inevitable, and then imagine a single voice, calm, measured, fearless, that changes everything. This is the story of Abigail, a woman whose name deserves to be remembered alongside the great heroes of faith. While warriors are celebrated for their strength and kings for their power, Abigail earned her place in sacred history through something rarer and more precious, the wisdom to see what needed to be done and the courage to do it. Her story takes place during a transitional period in Israel's history, a time of uncertainty and violence, when the old order was dying but the new order had not yet been born. It was an era that tested everyone who lived through it, demanding choices that would echo through generations. Chapter 1. The Wilderness King. The wilderness of Paran stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun, a landscape of stone and dust where only the hardiest could survive. In this unforgiving terrain, David lived as an outlaw, though destiny had already marked him for something far greater. Years earlier, the prophet Samuel had anointed him in secret, pouring sacred oil over the head of a shepherd boy and declaring him the future king of Israel. But standing between David and that throne was Saul, the current king, whose jealousy had turned to murderous obsession. David had done nothing to deserve this persecution except succeed where Saul had failed, slaying Goliath, winning battles, earning the love of the people. The irony of David's situation was profound and painful. He had been chosen by God, anointed by God's prophet, promised a kingdom and a dynasty. Yet he lived in caves and hid in the wilderness like a criminal. He commanded the loyalty of hundreds of brave men, yet possessed no land to call his own. He was Israel's greatest warrior, yet he spent his days running from Israel's king, rather than defending Israel's borders. So David ran. He gathered around him a band of men who had also been cast out by society. Those in debt, those in distress, those discontent with the current order. They numbered in the hundreds, these wilderness warriors, and they survived by their wits and their swords in the barren places where civilization's reach grew thin. These were not simple bandits or raiders, despite what some might have claimed. These were men who had been failed by the current system, who saw in David a leader worth following, who believed that Israel's future lay with this anointed fugitive rather than with the increasingly unstable king who currently sat on the throne. They were soldiers without an army, loyal to a king without a kingdom, living in the tension between what was and what would be. Despite his circumstances, David maintained a code of honor that set him apart from common bandits. When he and his men encountered shepherds tending flocks in the wilderness, they didn't rob them. Instead, they protected them from raiders and wild animals, forming a living wall around the vulnerable. They asked nothing in return, operating on the ancient principle that hospitality and mutual aid were sacred bonds, especially in harsh lands where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. This protection wasn't merely about being nice or maintaining good public relations, though those factors certainly played a role. It was about David's understanding of leadership and justice. he knew that how he acted now in these wilderness years would shape what kind of king he would become. He knew that God was watching, that his character was being tested and refined. He knew that the men who followed him were learning from his example, absorbing his values, becoming the kind of soldiers and leaders who would help him build a kingdom when the time came. The days in the wilderness were long and uncertain. David knew he was destined to be king, yet he lived as a fugitive. He had been chosen by God, yet he hid in caves. He commanded hundreds of loyal men, yet possessed no kingdom. This contradiction defined his existence: anointed but uncrowned, powerful but powerless, righteous but hunted. In these years of waiting, David learned patience. He learned to trust in divine timing rather than his own ambition. Twice he had opportunities to kill Saul and seize the throne by force, and twice he refused, unwilling to raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. Even though that same anointed king sought his destruction, David would not force God's hand. He would not take by violence what had been promised to him through providence. The first opportunity came in a cave at En-Gedi, where Saul entered alone, unaware that David and his men were hiding in the darkness deeper within. David's men whispered that God had delivered Saul into their hands, that this was the moment they had been waiting for. But David refused to kill Saul. Instead, he crept forward and cut off a corner of Saul's robe, then immediately felt guilty even for that small act of disrespect toward God's anointed. When Saul left the cave, David emerged and called out to him, showing him the piece of robe, proving that he could have killed Saul, but chose mercy instead. The second opportunity came in the wilderness of Ziph, where David and his nephew Abishai crept into Saul's camp at night and found the king sleeping, his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Again, David's companion urged him to kill Saul. One thrust of that spear would end the threat, forever. Again, David refused, taking only the spear and a water jug as proof of their visit, leaving Saul alive despite the danger he represented. These incidents revealed David's character. He would not compromise his principles even when doing so would have solved all his problems. He would not sin to escape persecution. He would not take by violence what God had promised to give him through providence. This restraint was not weakness but strength, the strength of a man who trusted God enough to wait, even when waiting was agonizing. But patience, as anyone who has practiced it knows, can be worn thin by hardship. And in the wilderness, hardship was the only constant companion. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day. The cold crept in at night. Water was scarce. Food was uncertain. Danger lurked constantly, not just from Saul's pursuing army, but from the wild animals and hostile tribes that inhabited the desert places. David and his men existed in a state of perpetual alertness, never fully resting, always watching the horizons for signs of threat. They moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked and cornered. They relied on the hospitality of those who supported David's cause, but such supporters were increasingly reluctant to help openly, fearing Saul's reprisal. In this context of constant stress and uncertainty, maintaining discipline and morale became a daily challenge. Men who were hungry and tired could become dangerous and unpredictable. Men who felt dishonoured could demand satisfaction. Men who had given up everything to follow a fugitive king needed to believe that their sacrifice meant something, that the promises would eventually be fulfilled. David understood all of this. He understood that leadership in the wilderness required not just military skill, but emotional intelligence, not just strategic thinking, but moral clarity. His men needed to see that their cause was just, that their leader was worthy, that their suffering had purpose. This is why the insult from Nabal cut so deeply. It wasn't just a personal affront to David. It was an attack on the entire enterprise, a public declaration that David and his men were worthless, that their protection meant nothing, that they deserved no respect or consideration. For men living on the edge of survival, maintaining their honour was not a luxury but a necessity. Without honour, they were just bandits. With honour, they were a kingdom waiting to be born. Chapter 2. The Wealthy Fool. Not far from where David and his men made their camp, in the fertile regions where the wilderness gave way to cultivated land, there lived a man named Nabal. His name meant fool, and seldom has a name been more prophetically appropriate. Whether his parents named him this at birth, recognizing something in his infant character, or whether it was a name he acquired later in life due to his behaviour, the text does not say. But by the time we meet him in this story, the name fits perfectly. Nabal was a fool, not in the sense of lacking intelligence. He had successfully managed substantial business operations and accumulated significant wealth. But in the deeper biblical sense of moral and spiritual folly, he was a fool because he lived as if there were no consequences to his actions, as if power and wealth made him immune to the natural order of justice, as if he could treat others with contempt without eventually facing the results of that contempt. Nabal was extraordinarily wealthy by the standards of his time and place. He owned 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, a fortune in livestock that required numerous servants and shepherds to manage. His wealth came from the land around Maon, and his business operations extended into Carmel, a fertile region where his flocks could graze and multiply. To put this wealth in perspective, most families in ancient Israel might own a few sheep or goats. A moderately prosperous family might have a dozen or two. A wealthy family might have 50 or 100. Nabal had thousands. His flocks represented not just wealth, but power, economic influence, social status, the ability to employ many people and control significant resources. This wealth had come to him through inheritance, business acumen, or some combination of both. The text doesn't detail how he acquired it, but it does make clear that he knew how to maintain and grow it. Shearing season, when his sheep were harvested for their wool, was a major commercial event that generated substantial revenue. The wool would be sold to traders, who would transport it to cities where it would be processed into cloth, which would then be made into garments. Nabal sat at the beginning of this economic chain, producing the raw material that fed an entire industry. Despite his material abundance, Nabal was poor in the qualities that truly matter. He was harsh in his dealings with others, seeing every interaction as a transaction to be one rather than a relationship to be honoured. He was stubborn, refusing to consider perspectives other than his own. He spoke cruelly and acted without wisdom, believing that his wealth gave him license to treat others with contempt. His harshness manifested in multiple ways. He drove hard bargains with those who had to deal with him, using his economic power to extract maximum value while giving minimum compensation. He spoke roughly to his servants, treating them not as people with dignity but as tools to be used. He ignored the traditional expectations of hospitality and generosity that were central to his culture's moral framework, acting as if his wealth exempted him from social obligations that others had to honour. His stubbornness meant that once he had decided on a course of action, no amount of reasoning could change his mind. He didn't see this as a flaw, but as strength of character, the ability to stick to his guns, to not be swayed by the opinions of others, to maintain his course regardless of circumstances. But there's a difference between principled consistency and foolish inflexibility. Nabal had the latter. He couldn't distinguish between standing firm on important matters and simply being too proud to admit he might be wrong. His household suffered under his character. Servants spoke of him in whispers, careful not to draw his attention or provoke his anger. Those who worked his fields and tended his flocks did so out of necessity, not loyalty. They feared him but didn't respect him. They obeyed him but didn't honour him. The difference might seem subtle, but it's profound. Fear can compel outward compliance, but it breeds resentment and disloyalty. Respect and honour, by contrast, create genuine commitment and faithfulness. The servants in Nabal's household developed elaborate strategies for managing his temper and minimising their contact with him. They learned to anticipate his moods, to stay out of his way when he was in a particularly foul disposition, to present information in ways that wouldn't trigger his anger. It was an exhausting way to live, always walking on eggshells, always calculating how to avoid the next explosion. Nabal inspired fear, perhaps, but never respect. Obedience, certainly, but never devotion. When his servants spoke of him among themselves, It was with resignation and barely concealed contempt. They stayed because they needed employment, because their families depended on the wages he paid, because leaving would mean starting over somewhere else with no guarantee of finding better circumstances. But they would have felt no particular loyalty if circumstances changed. They served Nabal, but they didn't serve him willingly. In this same household lived Nabal's wife, Abigail. The contrast between husband and wife could not have been more striking. Where Nabal was foolish, Abigail was wise. Where he was harsh, she was kind. Where he acted impulsively, she thought carefully. Scripture describes her as intelligent and beautiful, but these surface qualities barely hinted at the depths of her character. Abigail possessed what the ancient Hebrews called chokmah, wisdom that goes beyond mere knowledge to encompass understanding, discernment, and the ability to act rightly in complex situations. She saw not just what was, but what could be. She understood not just facts, but consequences. She could read situations with remarkable accuracy, perceiving the dynamics at play, the motivations of the people involved, the likely outcomes of various courses of action. This kind of wisdom is different from intelligence, though the two often go together. A person can be intelligent, able to learn quickly, to remember facts, to solve abstract problems, without being wise. Wisdom requires not just mental capacity, but emotional maturity, moral clarity, and what we might call situational awareness. It requires seeing the world as it truly is rather than as we wish it to be, and then acting appropriately based on that clear vision. Abigail also possessed tremendous emotional intelligence. She could read people, understanding not just what they said, but what they meant, not just what they claimed to feel, but what they actually felt. This ability made her effective in managing difficult situations and navigating complex social dynamics. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act boldly and when to exercise patience, when to be direct and when to be diplomatic. In a household ruled by folly, she maintained an island of reason. The servants knew they could come to her when problems arose that needed genuine wisdom, rather than Nabal's typical bluster and cruelty. She quietly smoothed over many situations that her husband's foolishness created, maintaining relationships with neighbours and business partners that Nabal would have destroyed through his harsh dealing. She was, in many ways, the real power holding the household together, even though her husband held the official authority. How she came to be married to such a man, we can only speculate. Perhaps it was an arranged marriage, as was common in that culture. Perhaps her family needed the economic alliance that marriage to a wealthy man provided. Perhaps Nabal had once been different, his character corroded over time by unchecked wealth and power, the way copper turns green with oxidation. Perhaps Abigail had simply done what countless wise people throughout history have done when circumstances placed them under foolish authority. She made the best of an impossible situation, exercising what influence she could while navigating the limitations she could not change. The text doesn't give us her inner thoughts about her marriage, doesn't tell us whether she had loved Nabal once or had always seen him clearly for what he was. It doesn't reveal whether she had been married to him for years or decades, whether they had children together, whether she had ever tried to reform his character or had long since given up that hope. What we know is that she had learned to survive in a difficult household, to maintain her own integrity while married to a man without integrity, to exercise wisdom even when surrounded by foolishness. Whatever the reason for their union, Abigail had learned to live with a difficult truth. She could not change her husband, but she could, when necessary, protect him from the consequences of his own folly. She had probably done this many times before in smaller ways, smoothing over an insult he had given, quietly compensating someone he had cheated, making excuses for behaviour that needed no excuse but would create problems if not addressed. She would soon need to do exactly that, but on a scale she had never faced before. This time, protecting Nabal from the consequences of his folly would require not just quiet diplomacy, but extraordinary courage. This time, the stakes would not be a lost business deal or a damaged reputation, but the lives of everyone in the household. Chapter 3. The Request and the Insult. Shearing time came to Carmel, a season of celebration and prosperity. The sheep had grown their wool through the year, and now that wool would be harvested, sold, and transformed into wealth. For a man as rich as Nabal, shearing time meant the movement of tremendous value, and traditionally, it was also a time of generosity, when wealthy landowners shared their abundance with those who had helped them throughout the year. The cultural expectations around shearing time were well established. It was understood that landowners would host feasts for their workers, would give gifts to those who had provided assistance during the year, would demonstrate through their generosity that they understood their wealth came not just from their own efforts, but from the broader community's support and cooperation. Stinginess during shearing time was considered shameful, a violation of social norms that could damage a person's reputation and standing in the community. David learned that Nabal was shearing his sheep in Carmel. He knew that his men had spent months protecting those very shepherds and flocks, forming a wall of protection around them in the lawless wilderness. Not a single sheep had been stolen, not one shepherd had been harmed. The shepherds themselves had acknowledged this protection, had been grateful for it, had recognized that David's men could have taken what they wanted but instead had acted honorably. The protection David's men had provided was substantial and valuable. The wilderness was full of threats, raiding parties from neighbouring tribes, wild animals like lions and bears, even individual thieves who would steal sheep and disappear into the wasteland. Shepherds were vulnerable, often young men or boys armed with nothing more than a staff and a sling. The presence of David's armed warriors created a zone of safety around Nabal's flocks that would otherwise not have existed. Moreover, David's men had not just refrained from stealing, they had actively protected the shepherds and flocks from others who would have stolen. This was the service of professional soldiers, security that someone like Nabal would normally have to pay for. David had provided it for free, asking nothing at the time, trusting in the traditional customs of hospitality and reciprocity that governed relations in that society. David's band had asked for nothing in return at the time, but now, at this season of plenty, he thought it reasonable to request some provisions. This was not extortion or a protection racket, though some might try to characterize it that way. This was a legitimate request based on services rendered, framed within the cultural expectations of that time and place. David was not demanding specific payment or threatening consequences. He was simply asking, during a season of abundance, if Nabal might share some of his prosperity with those who had helped protect it. He chose 10 young men from among his followers and gave them careful instructions. They were to approach Nabal with respect and courtesy. They were to greet him with words of peace and blessing. They were to remind him of the protection David's men had provided. And they were to make a humble request for whatever provisions Nabal felt appropriate to share. David's careful instructions reveal his understanding of how to approach such situations. He didn't send his most intimidating warriors or his roughest veterans. He sent young men who would seem less threatening. He didn't demand or threaten. He requested humbly. He didn't specify what he wanted or how much. He left it to Nabal's discretion, trusting in the man's sense of obligation and generosity. The messengers found Nabal at Carmel and delivered their message exactly as instructed. They spoke with deference and humility. They emphasized peace and friendship. They detailed the protection they had provided without compensation. And they asked, politely, if Nabal might share some food with David's men during this prosperous time. The greeting they delivered was formal and respectful. Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore be favourable toward my men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them. Every element of this message was calibrated to be non-threatening and respectful. The blessing at the beginning, the acknowledgement that this was a festive time, the invitation to verify their claims with his own servants, the humble request for whatever he could spare, the reference to David as Nabal's son, a term of respect indicating David's willingness to position himself as Nabal's inferior in this exchange. Nothing in the message could reasonably be interpreted as threatening or disrespectful. Nabal's response revealed the full extent of his character, his foolishness, his contempt for those he considered beneath him. "Who is David?" he sneered. "Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I've slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" The insult was carefully constructed and deliberately offensive. Every phrase was chosen to wound, to diminish, to express contempt. "Who is David?" This opening question pretended ignorance of one of the most famous men in Israel. David had killed Goliath in front of 2 armies. He had led successful military campaigns. He had been celebrated in songs sung throughout the nation. Everyone knew who David was. Nabal's pretense of not knowing was a calculated insult, suggesting that David was so insignificant as to be beneath notice. Who is this son of Jesse? By reducing David to son of Jesse, Nabal stripped him of any titles or honours, any recognition of his accomplishments. He wasn't the warrior who killed Goliath. He wasn't the commander who routed the Philistines. He was just Jesse's boy, a nobody from nowhere, presumably someone of no importance or standing. Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. This comparison was particularly venomous. Nabal was explicitly comparing David and his men to runaway slaves, to criminals who had fled their legal obligations, to rebels without legitimate cause. He was saying that David was not a warrior or a leader, but an outlaw, a troublemaker, someone who had abandoned his proper place in society and now lived outside the bounds of law and decency. "Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I've slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" This final section doubled down on the insult. By calling his provisions my bread, my water, my meat, emphasizing the possessive, emphasizing his ownership, Nabal made clear that he felt no obligation to share anything with anyone. The phrase, "men coming from who knows where," suggested that David's men were not just strangers, but potentially dangerous drifters, people of unknown origin and probably criminal character. The entire response violated every norm of hospitality, generosity, and basic human decency that governed that culture. Even if Nabal had wanted to refuse the request, there were polite ways to do so. He could have claimed he had already distributed all his excess provisions. He could have offered a token amount as a gesture of goodwill. He could have explained that times were hard and he needed to be careful with his resources. Any of these responses would have been socially acceptable, maintaining face for both parties. Instead, Nabal chose the most offensive possible response. He didn't just refuse help, he mocked and insulted the men who had provided him protection. He didn't just say no, he impugned their character, questioned their legitimacy, and treated them with open contempt. The messengers returned to David with empty hands and full reports of Nabal's contemptuous response. As they spoke, repeating Nabal's insults word for word, David's face darkened with anger. We can imagine the scene, the messengers delivering their report, probably with some embarrassment on behalf of the man they served, and David's reaction building as each phrase of Nabal's response was recounted. Here was a man who had treated David's kindness as weakness, who had returned good with evil, who had mocked and insulted him before his own men. David's restraint, his patience, his honour, all of it had been thrown back in his face by a wealthy fool who apparently believed his riches made him untouchable. For David, this was more than a personal insult. It was an attack on his authority, his legitimacy, his honour before his men. The men who followed David had given up everything to join him. Their homes, their security, their place in normal society. They followed him because they believed in him, because they thought he was destined for greatness, because they trusted his leadership. If David allowed himself and his men to be insulted with impunity, if he let some wealthy landowner treat them with contempt without consequences, how long before his authority eroded? How long before his men started to doubt whether following him had been the right choice? David's response was immediate and decisive. "Each of you strap on your sword," he commanded his men. They obeyed without hesitation, and 400 armed warriors prepared to march on Nabal's household. David himself strapped on his sword as well, his jaw set in grim determination. 400 men. Not a small raiding party, but a small army. Enough warriors to overwhelm. Any defence Nabal's household could mount to ensure total victory, to make absolutely certain that the message would be delivered with devastating force. As they marched, David's thoughts spiralled into righteous fury. His anger was not irrational. By any reasonable standard, he had been wronged. He had provided valuable service and asked reasonable compensation. He had approached respectfully and been answered with contempt. By the standards of that time and culture, he would have been justified in seeking satisfaction for the insult. "It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness so that nothing of his was missing," he said to those around him, his voice bitter with the taste of betrayal. "He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him." The oath was traditional and binding. David had sworn before God that he would kill every man in Nabal's household before the sun rose again. Not just Nabal himself, but every male in the household, servants, shepherds, anyone who lived under Nabal's authority. It was a blood oath, the kind that could not be taken back easily, the kind that committed David to a course of action from which retreat would bring shame. This oath reveals both David's fury and the cultural context in which he operated. In that time and place, honour killings in response to grievous insults were not uncommon. A man who failed to defend his honour and the honour of his men risked losing their respect and loyalty. The ancient world operated on codes of honour and shame that modern readers sometimes find difficult to fully understand. David was not being randomly violent. He was responding according to the logic of his culture and his circumstances. Yet even in his anger, even in his oath, there was something troubling. 400 warriors marching to slaughter an entire household because the head of that household had been rude. Women and children and servants who had done nothing wrong would die alongside the guilty party. This felt less like justice and more like massacre, less like righteous anger and more like disproportionate vengeance. But David, consumed by his fury, was not thinking clearly about proportionality or justice. He was thinking about respect and honour, about protecting his position as leader, about demonstrating to his men that no one could treat them with contempt without facing consequences. 400 warriors marched through the wilderness toward Carmel. Behind them, dust rose in clouds visible for miles. Before them, death waited to be delivered. The machinery of vengeance had been set in motion, and nothing, it seemed, could stop it. The march would take several hours, enough time for word to reach Nabal's household, enough time for terror to build, enough time for people to realise that death was coming and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But this reckoning had not accounted for Abigail. No one had considered that there might be someone in Nabal's household who possessed the wisdom to see a different path, the courage to take it, and the skill to persuade an angry warrior to abandon his sworn oath. Chapter 4. The Wisdom of a Careful Listener. One of Nabal's young servants, observing the exchange between his master and David's messengers, immediately understood the catastrophic danger. Unlike his employer, this young man possessed both intelligence and survival instinct. He didn't waste time trying to convince Nabal to change his mind. He knew that would be futile. Instead, he went directly to the one person in the household who might be able to do something: Abigail. The servant's decision to approach Abigail rather than Nabal tells us something important about the household dynamics. The servants knew who really held power, who could really solve problems, who possessed the wisdom and capability to address crises. It wasn't the man who held official authority. It was the woman who had earned genuine respect through her character and competence. "David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings," the servant explained urgently, his words tumbling out in his haste to convey the full scope of the danger. But he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were herding our sheep near them, nothing was missing. Night and day they were a wall around us the entire time we were with them taking care of our flocks. The servant's testimony was crucial. He confirmed that David's claims were absolutely true. The protection had been real, substantial, and valuable. He used vivid language, a wall around us night and day, to convey how complete and reliable that protection had been. He wanted Abigail to understand that David's request had been entirely reasonable, and that Nabal's refusal was not just rude but unjust. "Now think it over and see what you can do," he continued, his voice dropping to emphasize the gravity of what came next. "Because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He's such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." This final statement reveals multiple truths. First, the servant openly called his master wicked, showing that Nabal's character was recognized and condemned even by those who served him. Second, he acknowledged that talking to Nabal was impossible. The man could not be reasoned with, could not be persuaded, could not be made to see sense. Third, and most importantly, he made clear that the coming disaster would affect everyone, not just Nabal. Innocent people, servants, shepherds, women, children, would all die because of one man's foolish pride. The servant's message contained several crucial elements. First, he confirmed the truth of David's claims. The protection had been real and valuable. Second, he acknowledged his master's character. Nabal was indeed a fool who would not listen to reason. Third, he recognized the danger. Disaster was coming for the entire household, not just for Nabal himself. Fourth, he understood that disaster could be prevented if someone acted wisely and quickly. And fifth, by coming to Abigail, he implicitly acknowledged that she was the only person capable of addressing this crisis. Abigail listened carefully to every word. While others might have panicked or despaired at the news, her mind immediately began calculating options and strategies. She knew David's reputation. He was no ordinary bandit, but a proven warrior who had killed giants and routed armies. She knew that 400 armed men could annihilate everything and everyone in Nabal's household in a matter of hours. She understood that her husband's stubbornness made it impossible to reason with him directly, and she realized, with crystal clarity, that she had perhaps a few hours at most to prevent a massacre. Most importantly, Abigail understood something that her husband had failed to grasp. David was not just a wilderness chieftain, but the anointed future king of Israel. The prophet Samuel's anointing was known among those who paid attention to such things, even if the anointing had been conducted in secret. David's character, his victories, his supernatural protection from Saul's repeated attempts to kill him, all of this pointed to a man marked by destiny, chosen by God for a purpose. To insult such a man was not just rude, it was cosmically foolish, setting oneself against not just a powerful warrior, but against God's own chosen instrument. But Abigail also understood something else about David. He was a man who valued honour and righteousness. He had spared Saul's life when he could have taken it. He maintained discipline among his men in the lawless wilderness. He protected shepherds rather than robbing them. This was a man who could be reasoned with, if the reasoning was sound and the approach was wise. This was a man who had a conscience, who cared about doing right, who would listen to wisdom if it was presented properly. She made her decision instantly. She would act without consulting her husband, because consulting him would accomplish nothing except wasting precious time. She would take full responsibility for her actions, and she would trust that wisdom, properly applied, could accomplish what force could never achieve. Abigail moved with remarkable speed and efficiency. She understood that time was critical. Every minute that passed brought David's army closer to her household. She ordered her servants to gather provisions, and she specified generous quantities that would show real respect and appreciation. 200 loaves of bread, enough to feed David's entire band with some left over. 2 skins of wine, not cheap wine, but good quality wine appropriate for an important gift. 5 dressed sheep, already slaughtered and prepared for roasting. Substantial amount of meat, the kind of provision that required real effort and expense. Nearly 8 gallons of roasted grain, portable, nutritious, practical for men living in the wilderness. 100 cakes of raisins, sweet, energy-dense, valuable. 200 cakes of pressed figs, another luxury item showing that this was not some grudging minimum offering, but a genuine expression of generosity. These were substantial quantities, the kind of provision that showed both respect and generosity. More than what David had originally requested, enough to feed his entire band well. Abigail was not merely trying to buy her way out of trouble. She was correcting her husband's insult with genuine generosity, demonstrating the kind of hospitality that Nabal should have shown in the first place. The choice of provisions was strategic. She selected items that were valuable and appreciated, wine and meat and sweets, but also practical for men living in the wilderness. These were things David's men could use immediately and would genuinely appreciate. She was showing respect not just through the quantity, but through the thought put into what would actually be helpful and welcome. She had these provisions loaded onto donkeys, creating a visible caravan that would be impossible to miss. The sight of multiple donkeys loaded with food and wine would immediately communicate peaceful intent, would signal that whoever was coming was bringing gifts rather than weapons, was seeking reconciliation rather than conflict. She gave her servants explicit instructions. "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." This arrangement was carefully planned. The servants would arrive first, their laden donkeys making clear that this was a mission of peace and generosity. They would begin unloading the provisions, creating a visual tableau of abundance and goodwill. And then Abigail would arrive, able to speak with David after the initial impact of the generous provisions had already begun to soften his anger. The servants departed immediately, creating a caravan that would be visible from a distance. Meanwhile, Abigail told Nabal nothing. There was no point. He would either forbid her mission, and she would have to disobey him anyway, or he would ignore her warning, secure in his foolish confidence that his wealth made him untouchable. Either way, consulting him would waste time they didn't have. This was a moment that required action, not permission. Some might question whether Abigail was right to act without her husband's knowledge or consent. After all, wasn't she violating the proper order of authority in the household? Wasn't she being disobedient to her husband? But biblical wisdom literature consistently affirms that there are times when a higher principle must take precedence over a lower one. The preservation of innocent life takes precedence over formal procedures. Preventing evil takes precedence over maintaining appearances. Doing right takes precedence over doing what's expected. Abigail understood that this was one of those moments when wisdom required her to act beyond the normal boundaries of her role, because staying within those boundaries would result in catastrophe. She mounted her own donkey and began riding toward the wilderness, toward the armed men marching to destroy her household. She rode alone, following her servants at a distance, moving steadily toward the confrontation that would determine whether wisdom or violence would prevail. As she rode, Abigail likely prayed. She would have asked God for wisdom in choosing her words, for courage to speak boldly when the moment came, for divine favour in turning David's heart from vengeance. She would have committed herself and her mission to God's providence, trusting that if she acted rightly, God would honour her faithfulness. She also likely considered carefully what she would say when she met David face to face. She understood that words would be her only weapons, and that those words would need to be chosen with perfect precision. Too much deference might seem insincere or manipulative. Too little might inflame David's anger further. She would need to acknowledge the wrong done to him while not defending her husband's actions. She would need to appeal to David's better nature while respecting his legitimate grievances. She would need to remind him of his destiny without seeming to lecture him. She would need to turn his anger away from violence without suggesting that his anger itself was unjustified. All of this would need to be accomplished while speaking to a man she had never met, who was currently marching toward her home with 400 armed warriors intent on slaughter, who had sworn an oath before God to kill every male in her household before morning. The odds were not in her favour. A wrong word, a misjudged tone, a poorly chosen argument, any of these could result in David dismissing her and continuing his march toward violence. But wisdom, Abigail knew, often succeeds precisely when the odds suggest it should fail. And she was about to demonstrate that principle in a way that would be remembered for thousands of years. Chapter 5. The Meeting in the Ravine. The geography of that fateful encounter is significant and worth pausing to consider. Abigail rode down into a mountain ravine, a place where the land itself created natural walls on either side, focusing attention, limiting distractions, creating a kind of natural amphitheatre where every word would carry weight and importance. Ravines in that region were formed by seasonal water flow, carved over centuries by occasional flash floods that rushed through during the rainy season. During the dry season, they became natural passages through the mountainous terrain, shadowed by the steep walls on either side, cooler than the exposed hillsides, often the quickest route between locations but also potential places of ambush. And there, coming from the opposite direction, she saw them. David and his men, 400 warriors, armed and grim-faced, marching with the purposeful stride of men committed to violence. At their head, David himself still burning with the fury of insult and betrayal. They'd come too far to turn back easily. The momentum of anger carried them forward, and the oath David had sworn gave that momentum the force of sacred obligation. Imagine the visual impact of that moment. Abigail, a woman alone on a donkey, riding toward an army. The contrast could not have been more stark. 1 against 400. Peace against war, wisdom against fury. Any reasonable person would have been terrified. But Abigail's courage came not from absence of fear, but from conviction that what she was doing was right and necessary. When Abigail saw David, she acted quickly, her movements deliberate and practiced. She dismounted from her donkey and bowed down before him with her face to the ground, the deepest form of respect and submission in her. Culture. This was not weakness, but strategy. She immediately diffused any perception that she came in defiance or pride. She acknowledged David's authority and position. She showed humility without grovelling, respect without civility. The act of dismounting and bowing would have required David and his men to stop. They couldn't simply march past a woman prostrated in their path. This gave Abigail her opening, created the space for words to be spoken and heard. Then she spoke, and in speaking she demonstrated why wisdom is sometimes called the highest gift, why Solomon asked God for wisdom above all other possible gifts, why the book of Proverbs consistently presents wisdom as more valuable than gold or silver or any material treasure. "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you," she began, her voice clear and steady despite the circumstances. "Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my lord sent." Notice the structure and wisdom of her opening. She asked permission to speak, showing respect for David's authority, even though he had no formal authority over her. She referred to herself as your servant multiple times, positioning herself as someone under David's care rather than as an adversary or even a neutral party. This was strategic. By calling herself his servant, she appealed to his responsibility as a leader to listen to those under his protection. She immediately disavowed her husband's actions, calling Nabal what he was, wicked and foolish. She didn't make excuses for him, didn't try to minimize what he had done, didn't ask David to understand or forgive Nabal's perspective. She simply acknowledged the truth. Nabal was a fool, and his response had been foolish. By doing this, she separated herself from his actions while taking responsibility for her household's obligations. She explained that she had not been present when David's messengers came, establishing that she bore no personal responsibility for the insult. This wasn't an excuse but a statement of fact. If she had been there, the implication was clear. Things would have gone differently. David's men would have been welcomed and provided for as they deserved. In these opening sentences, Abigail accomplished several things simultaneously. She showed respect without weakness. She acknowledged wrong without defending it. She established her own character as distinct from her husband's. She created a foundation for everything else she was about to say. But Abigail was just beginning. She continued, her words carefully chosen, building her argument with the precision of a skilled advocate. "And now, my lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my lord be like Nabal, and let this gift, which your servant has brought to my lord, be given to the men who follow you." This passage is masterful in its construction, revealing Abigail's deep understanding of how to appeal to a person's better nature. She invoked the name of God, reminding David that his actions would be witnessed and judged by a higher authority than any human. She didn't threaten David with divine judgment. That would have been counterproductive. But she framed the situation in terms of David's relationship with God. She reframed what was happening in the present moment. David had not yet shed blood. God, through Abigail's intervention, was keeping him from that action. By framing it this way, she made it easier for David to change course without losing face. He wasn't backing down from his oath. He was accepting God's intervention to prevent him from doing something he would later regret. She pronounced a curse on David's real enemies, lumping Nabal, together with them as equally foolish and deserving of divine judgment. This was clever. She wasn't asking David to forget the offence or pretend it didn't matter. She was simply asking him to leave the judgment to God rather than taking it into his own hands. David's honour would be satisfied through divine justice rather than human violence. She called the provision she had brought a gift freely given, restoring honour to the interaction. This wasn't payment extracted under duress or compensation offered out of fear. It was a gift from a friend, the kind of generous provision that should have been offered in the first place. By framing it as a gift, she allowed David to accept it without feeling that he was being bought off or manipulated. She pressed on, speaking with increasing boldness, her confidence growing as she saw that David was actually listening. "Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling." Here, Abigail revealed her understanding of David's true identity and destiny. This was not information available to just anyone. The fact that she knew about David's anointing, knew about God's promises to him, knew about his destiny to establish a lasting dynasty. All of this showed that she was a woman who paid attention to what mattered, who understood the deeper spiritual realities beneath the surface events of her time. She knew he would establish a dynasty, not hoped, not guessed, but knew with the certainty of faith in God's promises. She knew he fought the Lord's battles, framing his military activities not as those of a bandit or rebel, but as someone carrying out divine purposes. She knew that no wrongdoing would be found in him. This was both a statement of confidence in his character and a subtle warning that if he slaughtered her household, that would be wrongdoing that would stain his record. She used beautiful imagery to describe God's protection of David. Bound securely in the bundle of the living, evoked the image of something precious being wrapped carefully and protected, the way valuable items were bundled for safekeeping. David's life was in God's hands, protected by divine care, immune to the schemes of his enemies no matter how powerful they seemed. And then she reminded him of his greatest victory, referencing his defeat of Goliath with a sling, turning that image into a promise that God would handle his enemies just as David had once felled a giant. With a single stone from a sling, David had defeated Israel's greatest enemy. With similar efficiency and power, God would deal with all of David's foes. The message was clear. David didn't need to take vengeance into his own hands. God was fully capable of handling his enemies. Then came the crucial turning point, the heart of her argument, the appeal that would ultimately change everything. "When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant." This was the masterstroke, the argument that cut through all the anger and wounded pride to touch something deeper in David's character. Abigail asked David to think not about the present moment of anger, but about his future. She asked him to imagine himself years from now, sitting on Israel's throne, looking back on this day. When he became king, not if, but when, treating his future as an established fact, speaking with the confidence of faith, would he want to look back on this day with regret? Would he want to carry the weight of having slaughtered an entire household over an insult? Would he want his conscience stained with unnecessary violence? Would he want to remember that he had killed innocent people because their master had been rude to him? She called it the staggering burden of needless bloodshed, acknowledging that taking life has weight, has consequences, leaves marks on the soul of the one who does it. Even justified killing carries weight. But needless killing, disproportionate killing, killing driven by anger rather than justice, that kind of bloodshed becomes a burden that never fully lifts, a stain that never quite washes clean. She appealed to David's conscience, to his sense of who he was and who he wanted to be. She reminded him that he was not just a warrior but a man of God, not just a fighter, but someone called to lead God's people. She called him to his higher self, to the man God had anointed him to be, not the angry warrior he was in that moment. And notice what she didn't do. She never directly criticised David. She never suggested that his anger was unjustified, or that Nabal's insult didn't matter. She never implied that David was wrong to feel offended, or that he should simply swallow the insult and move on. Instead, she elevated David above the situation. She reminded him that he was destined for greater things than petty vengeance. She showed him a path forward that would preserve his honour without requiring violence. Her final request, "Remember your servant," was both humble and wise. She wasn't demanding reward or recognition. She was simply asking David to remember that she had helped him avoid a terrible mistake. And the phrase carried an implied promise. When David became king, when he held power and authority, she trusted that he would remember this day and the woman who had shown him wisdom. Throughout her speech, which probably lasted only a few minutes but contained the distilled wisdom of a lifetime, Abigail demonstrated mastery of persuasive communication. She showed respect while speaking boldly. She acknowledged legitimate grievances while pointing toward better responses. She appealed to self-interest while grounding everything in spiritual truth. She offered practical solutions while addressing deeper principles. Most importantly, she spoke as someone who believed in David, who saw not just who he was in that moment, but who he was meant to become. She spoke as someone who understood that great leaders sometimes need to be reminded of their greatness, that angry men sometimes need to be shown a path away from their anger, that pride sometimes needs to be given away to back down without losing face. Chapter 6. When wisdom dissolves. Fury, David stood silent as Abigail spoke, listening to every word. The men around him watched, probably with some surprise, wondering how their commander would respond to this unexpected intervention. They had been marching toward violence, committed to an oath, convinced of the righteousness of their cause. Now here was this woman, speaking words that challenged everything they had been thinking, offering a perspective they hadn't considered. The moment stretched, balanced between violence and peace, between the momentum of anger and the pull of wisdom. David's next words would determine whether 400 warriors would turn back or continue forward, whether an entire household would live or die. Then David spoke, and in his words, everyone present heard the sound of anger transforming into something else entirely, not disappearing, but being redirected, being elevated, being refined into something better than blind rage. "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me," David said, his voice carrying a note of wonder, as if he was only now fully recognizing how close he had come to disaster. "May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." These words revealed several truths about David's character and about what had just happened. First, David recognized divine intervention. God had sent Abigail to stop him. This wasn't just a lucky accident or a clever woman taking initiative. This was providence, divine orchestration, God actively working to prevent David from making a terrible mistake. Second, he acknowledged that Abigail had saved him from bloodshed. Not saved Nabal, that's what we might expect him to say, but saved David himself. He understood that he was the one who needed saving, that he was the one about to commit an act he would regret. The violence would have stained him more than it would have hurt Nabal, who would have been dead and beyond regret. Third, he confirmed what he had intended to do. The slaughter would have been total. Not one male would have survived. He didn't soften this or try to minimize it. He stated it plainly, acknowledging the full extent of what he had been about to do, owning the reality that his anger had been leading him toward mass murder. Fourth, by speaking these things aloud before his men, David demonstrated the kind of leadership that would eventually make him a great king. He didn't try to save face by pretending he hadn't really meant it, didn't minimize his anger or the oath he had sworn. Instead, he publicly acknowledged that he had been wrong, that he had needed correction, that this woman's wisdom had been greater than his fury. This is what wisdom does in the presence of anger. It doesn't deny the anger or call it invalid. It doesn't argue against the reasons for the anger, or suggest that the offended party should just get over it. Instead, it provides perspective, appeals to deeper values, offers a path forward that preserves honour without requiring violence. Wisdom acknowledges that anger can be righteous while still recognising that righteous anger can lead to unrighteous actions. It creates space for people to change course without losing face, to redirect their energy toward better ends without denying the legitimacy of their feelings. David accepted the provisions Abigail had brought, a visible sign that he was accepting her entire message, not just taking the food while continuing with his original plan. "Go home in peace," he told her, his voice now calm, the fury drained away. "I have heard your words and granted your request." Those simple words contained multitudes. David acknowledged that he had truly heard her, not just listened to the sound she made, but understood the wisdom she was offering. He had heard her with his mind and his heart, had allowed her words to penetrate past his anger to touch something deeper in his character, and he granted her request, which was nothing less than the lives of everyone in her household. 400 warriors who had sworn to kill every male in Nabal's house would now return to their camps without having shed any blood. Servants who would have died for their master's folly would live. Shepherds who had done nothing wrong would continue tending their flocks. An entire household was saved because one woman had the wisdom to act and the courage to speak. With those words, the crisis ended. The immediate danger passed. 400 warriors who had been marching toward massacre turned around and headed back to their wilderness camps. The machinery of vengeance, once set in motion, had been stopped by the intervention of the wisdom. The men began to disperse, probably with mixed feelings. Some might have felt relief. Killing an entire household isn't something most people want to do, even when they're angry. Some might have felt disappointment. They had worked themselves up for violence and now had to let that energy dissipate without release. Some might have felt admiration for David, seeing in his willingness to change course evidence of the kind of wisdom that makes good leaders. Some might have gained new respect for the power of the well-spoken words to change outcomes that seemed inevitable. Abigail had accomplished the impossible, with no weapons except words, with no authority except her own moral clarity, with no power except the power of truth spoken well. She had prevented a tragedy. She had saved her household from death. She had protected David from a decision he would have regretted for the rest of his life. And she had demonstrated that the right words, spoken at the right time in the right way, can accomplish what armies cannot. As she prepared to return to her household, Abigail must have felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the immediate danger had passed, exhaustion from the intensity of what she had just experienced. Perhaps some trepidation about what she would face when she returned home and her husband learned what she had done, but also surely a deep satisfaction in knowing that she had done the right thing, that she had acted according to wisdom and conscience, that she had saved innocent lives through her courage and skill. The sun was likely getting lower in the sky by now. The shadows in the ravine would have been lengthening. Abigail mounted her donkey and began the journey home, back to a household that had no idea how close it had come to annihilation, back to a husband who was probably still celebrating his shearing feast without any awareness of the disaster that had been averted. She rode home carrying the knowledge that she had changed history, though she probably didn't think of it in such grand terms. She had simply done what needed to be done, what her wisdom told her was right, what her conscience demanded. She had demonstrated that one person acting with courage, And wisdom at the right moment can change outcomes that seem inevitable, can redirect the course of events, can prevent tragedies that others thought were unstoppable. Chapter 7. The Fate of Folly. Abigail returned to her home in Carmel as evening was settling over the land. The dust of David's departing army had settled behind her. The crisis had passed, but she now faced a different challenge, dealing with her husband and the aftermath of what she had done. She found Nabal hosting a feast, and the description Scripture provides is revealing, a feast like that of a king. This detail tells us much about Nabal's character and self-perception. He wasn't content to have a normal celebration. He had to display his wealth, had to demonstrate his status, had to make sure everyone understood just how rich and important he was. He was drunk, celebrating his wealth and his shearing season, completely unaware that his household had come within hours of annihilation, while Abigail had been racing to intercept David's army, while servants had been loading donkeys with provisions in desperate haste, while 400 armed men had been marching toward them with swords drawn and death in their eyes. Nabal had been drinking wine and congratulating himself on his prosperity. The scene would be almost comical if it weren't so tragic. A man completely oblivious to the danger he had created through his own foolishness, celebrating in ignorance while others saved him from the consequences of his actions. He had no idea that every person at his feast owed their life to his wife's wisdom and courage. He had no idea how close he had come to destroying everything through his stubborn pride. Abigail said nothing to him that night. There was no point in trying to communicate with a drunk man, especially one as foolish as Nabal, even when sober. She had learned through long experience that some conversations are futile, that some moments are wrong for truth-telling, that wisdom includes knowing when to speak and when to wait. So she waited through the night, waited through his drunken revelry, waited for morning when sobriety might make understanding possible. We can imagine her during those hours, exhausted from her journey and the emotional intensity of her confrontation with David, but unable to rest, knowing that she still had to face her husband, still had to tell him what she had done, still had to deal with the aftermath of her actions. When morning came and Nabal had sobered up, his head probably aching from the previous night's excess, Abigail told him everything. She didn't soften the truth or minimize the danger. She explained about David's messengers and his own contemptuous response. She described the 400 armed men who had been marching toward their home with sworn intent to kill every male in the household. She detailed her intervention, the provisions she'd taken without his knowledge or permission, and her meeting with David in the ravine. She made absolutely clear exactly how close they had all come to death, how his foolish insult had nearly cost everyone their lives. The news had a dramatic and immediate effect. Scripture says that Nabal's heart failed him, and he became like a stone. This description suggests either a stroke or some form of shock so profound that he became paralyzed, unable to move or speak. Medical historians have speculated about the exact nature of Nabal's condition. Perhaps a massive stroke, perhaps a heart attack, perhaps a psychological shock so severe that it manifested as physical paralysis. Whatever the medical mechanism, the meaning is clear. The man who had been so certain of his own importance and invulnerability, who had been celebrating with royal pretensions just hours earlier, suddenly came face to face with the consequences of his folly, the reality of how close he had come to death, the understanding of how his own actions had nearly destroyed everyone and everything he possessed. The humiliation of learning that his wife had to save him from his own stupidity, all of this crashed down on him with crushing force. Some speculate that what killed Nabal was not just physical shock, but spiritual and psychological devastation. He had built his identity on his wealth and status, on the illusion that his riches made him untouchable and superior. Now he had to confront the reality that his wealth meant nothing in the face of real power, that his status hadn't protected him, that he had been completely vulnerable and had been saved only through the intervention of the wife he had probably treated with contempt. For a proud man, a man whose name meant fool, but who probably believed himself quite clever, this realization might have been more devastating than any physical blow. His entire self-image collapsed. Everything he had believed about himself and the world was revealed as false. And unlike physical injuries which can heal, damage to one's fundamental sense of self can be fatal. He lingered for about 10 days in this condition, neither dead nor truly alive, existing in some twilight state between the two. We don't know if he was conscious during this time, if he could hear or understand what was happening around him, if he experienced this time as suffering or simply as a kind of blankness. The text is spare in its details, telling us only that he remained like a stone for approximately 10 days. Then he died. The text simply states that the Lord struck Nabal and he died, leaving the exact mechanism ambiguous, but the meaning clear. Nabal's death was connected to his character and his actions. God's justice had found him. The consequences he had created through his own foolishness had finally caught up to him. When David heard that Nabal was dead, his response revealed his character and his understanding of what had happened. He didn't gloat over the death of an enemy. He didn't celebrate that someone who had insulted him had suffered and died. Instead, he praised God and acknowledged how God had worked in the entire situation. Praise be to the Lord who has